Some ideas are so powerful they're treated as threats. They're not just theories or passing thoughts. They're sparks that reshape entire worlds. Think of the witch hunts, where a single belief could turn neighbour against neighbour. Or propaganda, where stories weren't told to inform, but to control. These are the kinds of forbidden ideas that leave deep marks on history, and tonight we'll explore many more of them. So get comfortable, because this is going to be a long one. A small boat slides along the coast, quiet as a cat. The captain keeps the land in sight. He watches the line where water meets sky and does not cross it. He feels the edge in his bones, even though he cannot see an edge at all. Long ago, many people thought the world was flat, like a giant table. That idea shaped how they moved, how they drew maps, and how they felt about danger and home. If the world is flat in your mind, the middle feels safe. The edges feel scary, so you sail from cove to cove and from light to light. You stack short trips like stepping stones. You choose a bay you know instead of open sea. You trade with towns you can reach before night. Your map is a chain of coasts, not a wide blue path. You write down rocks and reefs, not far away islands. You listen to stories of sea beasts and dark fog, and you give those places a wide turn. Map makers draw what people believe. They draw a circle of land with water around it. They put a special city near the centre. They fill the blank spaces with wind angels and long fish. A map like this is a mirror for the heart. It tells you where you belong and where you should not go. It is less about miles and more about meaning. It says, stay near. It says, do not fall. This idea did more than steer boats. It shaped minds. When you think in edges, you look for fences. You trust rules that say, stop here. You teach children that the safe place is the middle, and you praise them for staying close. The flat earth idea made fear feel wise. It made caution look like courage, but the sea has its own lessons. Sailors watched the way ships sank mast first over the curve. They saw new stars appear when they went south. They measured shadows at noon and found them different in different towns. Tools grew better. Compasses stayed true. Astrolabes turned the sky into a guide. Little by little, the horizon became not an end, but a clue. The world was not a table. It was a ball. With a round world in mind, maps changed. Lines of latitude and longitude made a net over the oceans. Blank spaces turned into routes. The open water became a bridge. People dared to sail out of sight of land, and then they came back with proof in their holds and stories on their tongues. Trade grew. Ideas crossed oceans. The middle of the map was no longer one place. It was wherever you stood. The flat earth idea was wrong about shape, but it shows a true thing about us. What we believe sets the borders of our steps. Change the picture in your head, and the path under your feet grows wider. The edge turns into a horizon, and the horizon invites you on. A cool room, a wooden chair, a bright metal blade, a soft voice that says, "This will help." For a long time, this was the picture of care. You came in weak or hot with fever. You sat still. A vein was opened. Blood ran into a bowl. A bandage was tied. People nodded and said, "Better now." It looked like action. It felt like hope. The idea behind it sounded simple. People thought the body had 4 main fluids. They said sickness came when those fluids were out of balance. If you had too much, let some out. If you were too full, make space. You could see the blood leave, so the story felt true. A clear cause, a clear fix. Fear likes clear. So tools and rules grew around the idea. There were shiny lancets in tidy cases. There were jars of leeches kept cool and wet. There were charts that told which days were best. Barbers and doctors learned the same steps. Towns set prices. Families saved coins for visits they could watch with their own eyes. It was care you could see, and what you can see is easy to believe. But seen does not mean healed. Many sick people lost the very strength they needed to fight. They felt dizzy and cold. Some did not wake up. When that happened, the blame went to the illness, not the cut. When someone lived, the story won more trust. When someone died, the story stayed the same. That is how a wrong idea can grow strong. It wears the clothing of habit. It hides inside words like tradition and skill. Slowly, a different way took root. People began to measure, not guess. Thermometers turned heat into numbers. Scales showed when bodies were losing too much. Careful notes told quiet truths. Patients who kept their blood did better. Clean hands, rest, water and time helped more than a bowl and a blade. The loud fix began to look like harm. The gentle steps began to look like real care. Still, change was hard. It is hard to stop doing what looks brave. It is hard to say, I do not know. So let us watch and learn. But brave people did say it. They asked for proof. They checked what happened next, not just what happened during. Little by little, the old idea cracked. The bloodletting idea shows us something plain. A belief can shape rooms, tools, jobs and trust. It can make a whole town move in one way. So we must ask simple, strong questions. Does this help most people most of the time? What do the numbers say? Can we do less harm? Choose care that listens. Choose care you can count. Let quiet truth be louder than a shiny blade. A spark in the dark. Then a shout. People hurry into the town square. Faces look tight like fists. Someone says a name. The name hangs in the air like a storm cloud. One person points, another nods. Fear moves from one face to the next, quick as a match. Long ago, many towns believed in witches. They thought a person could call wind, spoil milk, or make a baby sick with a glare. When crops failed or storms hit, they needed a reason. Fear loves a simple story. The witch hunt idea gave them one. It said, find a person to blame, and the fear will stop. The hunt had steps, and none were fair. A neighbour whispered a rumour. A birthmark became a sign. A jar of herbs became a spell. People were forced to pass strange tests. If you floated, they said, you were a witch. If you sank, you might drown. No test could show the truth, only the fear. Still, crowds called it justice. It was not. Tools and rules grew around the idea. There were lists of names and harsh prayers. There were ropes, wood, and courts that felt more like plays than truth. Some leaders spoke with loud voices and hard eyes. They said they were saving the town. They were not. Innocent people were taken from their homes. Mothers, daughters, neighbours. Fires were built. Smoke climbed. The town said the fire would make them safe, but safety does not come from hurting the wrong person. Why did so many follow along? Because fear is heavy. Because it is easier to blame one person than to face a bad harvest or a hard winter. Because speaking up can make you the next name called. Some stayed silent to stay safe. Some believed the lies. Some were too tired to ask questions. The witch hunt idea turned rumour into law and worry into action. Slow change began when a few brave minds asked for proof. They watched and wrote down what they saw. They learned that pain does not make truth. They saw that hurt spread like a fire, burning trust along with wood. A few judges started to say, "This is not enough." Some towns said, a person is innocent until there is clear, real proof. The fire in the square began to fade. The witch hunt idea teaches us a plain lesson. Ideas can shape a whole town. They can lead us to care or to harm, so we choose with care. Listen before you judge. Ask for facts, not just fear. Stand by the person who stands alone. Speak soft, but speak. When a crowd grows hot, bring cool water. That is how a town becomes a true community again. A grey morning. A factory whistle blows. Gates swing open and tired people walk in. A man in a tall hat looks down from a window and says, "Only the strong should rise." A boy ties his boots tighter and thinks, "I must be strong or I do not belong." This is how the social Darwinism idea felt in everyday life. It said the strongest deserve to win, and if you're not winning, you deserve to lose. Some people took a science idea about plants and animals and twisted it to talk about people. They said, life is a fight and the winners are better. They said, rich means worthy and poor means weak. They said, help makes people soft, so do not help. This story gave a simple reason for hard things. If a family was hungry, they said, it is their fault. If a worker was hurt, they said, he should have been tougher. The idea made cruel choices feel clean. Rules and rooms were built to match the story. Factory owners locked doors and called it order. Landlords raised rents and called it nature. Leaders took land far away and called it progress. Schools kept some children out and called it fair. When someone asked for safer streets or clean water or shorter hours, the answer was no, because only the strong deserve comfort. The ladder was pulled up and nailed to the roof. The idea grew because it helped the winners feel proud and the bystanders feel calm. It was easier to blame the weak than to fix a broken rule. It was easier to say try harder than to build a ramp. It was easier to say that pain makes you better than to stop the pain. But easy is not the same as true, and loud is not the same as right. Slowly other voices rose. Nurses saw that care saves lives. Teachers saw that a kind push opens doors. Workers stood together and asked for light, air, and safe machines. Neighbours started soup kitchens and clinics. Writers told stories that made hidden hurt easy to see. Bit by bit, towns made rules that said every person matters. We got clean water, fire escapes, seat belts, and fair pay rules. We learned that teams are strong too. Nature itself shows more than fighting. Geese fly in a V and take turns at the front. Ants share food. Trees link roots and warn each other of bugs. Strength can mean lifting together. It can mean making space, not closing doors. It can mean helping someone stand so they can help the next person. The social Darwinism idea teaches a clear lesson. Ideas can guide hands, laws, and hearts. So ask simple, strong questions. Who is helped? Who is harmed? Who decides what strong means? Choose a story that makes room for more people to stand up. Measure success by how many can join, not by how many are left behind. Call kindness a kind of strength. Call fairness a kind of wisdom. That is how a cold grey morning can warm, little by little, for everyone. Ink dries, a radio hums, a bright poster glows in a shop window. A voice on a loudspeaker says the same words again and again. People nod, feet march, hearts beat to the same drum. This is how a whole town can be moved by a story on repeat. The propaganda idea says, control what people hear and see, and you can guide what they think. Make one story loud and keep other stories quiet. Use strong feelings to push the message. If you see the same thing everywhere, it starts to feel like truth, even when it is not. It works by making things simple. It gives you heroes to cheer and enemies to fear. It wraps hard problems in easy words. It uses big slogans, bright flags, and music that makes your chest rise. It shows smiling faces when it wants pride, and dark shadows when it wants fear. Repeat, 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 until the words feel like a memory. Many tools help the push. There are speeches on the radio, articles in the paper, films before a show, and lessons in a classroom. There are parades with drums and banners in the square. There are posters on every wall. People share the same line at work, at school, at dinner. Soon the town sounds like one voice. When this happens, questions grow quiet. Curiosity shrinks. A neighbour who asks for proof is called disloyal. A joke can be taken as a crime. A rumour becomes a rule. Votes can tilt. Rights can slip away. A nation can cheer harm and call it safety. The map of what is true and what is false gets turned upside down, and many feel afraid to say so. But there are ways to stay steady. Slow down when a message makes you very angry or very proud. Ask, who gains if I believe this? Look for the source. Can you find the same facts in more than one place? Listen for the quiet voices, not only the loud ones. Talk to someone who thinks differently and try to repeat their view back fairly. Truth can stand a second look. We can also build strong habits together. Keep free libraries open. Support news that checks facts. Teach children how to spot tricks with words and pictures. Share corrections kindly. Make room for many voices at the table. The goal is not to win the loudest. The goal is to see clearly. Stories are tools. They can build or break. Choose the ones that help us care for each other. Let facts lead feelings, not the other way around. When we do that, the drumbeat slows, the window opens, and fresh air comes in. Picture a quiet barn at dawn, the smell of hay, the orderly rows, the farmer choosing which animals will breed and which will not. Now slide that image across a continent and into a courthouse, a school, a clinic. Keep the rows, keep the choosing. Replace the animals with people. That is the unsettling spark behind the eugenics idea. It began with an innocent shine. If we can breed faster horses and sweeter corn, why not stronger, smarter, better humans? The promise wore a white coat and spoke in charts. It made complex lives look like tidy columns. It smoothed the mess of poverty, illness, and difference into a single line, improved the stock. The language sounded modern, helpful, even kind. Words like fitness and heredity and progress turned into tools that could shape a nation. Then tools became rules. Politicians wrote laws that let the state decide who could have children and who could not. Doctors learned to wield a new kind of authority, one that reached into the most private parts of a life. School reports, police notes, and whispered judgments about a person's worth were piled into files. A label like feeble-minded or delinquent or unfit could follow someone into the operating room without their consent. The idea that humans could be bred like animals moved from lecture halls into surgery suites. Sterilization, done in the name of mercy or efficiency, became official policy. The targets were not random. They were the poor, the institutionalized, the disabled. They were immigrants whose names were hard to pronounce. They were indigenous women, black women, girls in state care, men in prisons, and anyone who seemed to make the tidy columns go messy. Many were young. Many were told they were getting a routine procedure, a treatment, a fix for a problem someone else had defined for them. Some learned the truth only years later, when they tried to start a family and discovered the choice had been stolen. The harm was often quiet, leaving no headlines, only empty cradles and a silence that lingered in kitchens and bedrooms for decades. Courts offered cover. Officials said society had a right to protect itself. The metaphor of the farm hardened into doctrine. If certain traits were believed to weaken the nation, then preventing those births became an act of public good. It was presented as scientific, neat, and humane. But beneath the diagrams and sealed envelopes was an old impulse to sort people, to rank them, to control them, to hide prejudice behind the clean lines of a graph. The logic seemed airtight until it wasn't. A small tear appeared whenever a person told their story. A young woman who was labelled for being poor, not broken. A boy whose learning difference became a sentence. A family that could not grieve what they were never allowed to have. That tear widened when the world watched another country carry the same logic to a murderous extreme, proving how easily tidy lines can turn into train tracks. The shame that followed did not erase the paperwork, and in many places the practice did not stop right away. Bureaucracies moved slowly, even when lives were at stake. What makes the eugenics idea so dangerous is its convenience. It promises that human complexity can be managed like a garden under perfect instructions. Pull the weeds, prune the branches, and the future will bloom. But people are not plants. The traits we carry are braided with history, environment, chance, and grace. Reducing a life to a percentage or a prediction turns care into control. It invites us to mistake power for wisdom. And yet, the echo continues. Today, we carry tools far sharper than those old scalpels. We can read genomes and edit them. We can screen for risks before birth, tag traits in databases, and chart futures in dazzling colours. Used with humility, these tools can ease suffering and heal. Used with the old hunger to sort and rule, they can revive the same cold arithmetic of worth. The line between care and control is still thin, and it is still ours to guard. So remember what the barn feels like. The rouse, the choosing, the hush. Ask who gets to make the lists, and who disappears when the lists are followed. Ask why the urge to tidy a society so often begins with cutting away the lives that do not fit. And when someone speaks of better stock, improved humanity, or the greater good, listen for the seams in the logic. Look for the people hidden behind the words. An idea can change the world, with a whisper or with a court seal. This idea did both. It arrived wearing concern, then left scars. The lesson it offers is not a ban on knowledge, but a demand that we place dignity above neat outcomes, that we choose care over control, that we refuse to let charts decide whose future is worth having. If there is any breeding to be done, let it be the slow cultivation of empathy, the hard work of justice, and the daily practice of seeing one another not as stock to be managed, but as lives to be honoured. A cardboard sign flaps on a quiet street. Free if you can carry it. A couch, a coffee table, a stack of paperbacks, all waiting for strangers. The woman who set them out stands in the doorway with a calm you only see after a decision has already been made. Her neighbour asks if she's moving. She smiles like someone who knows a secret and says, "Not moving, arriving." That is how the Doomsday Idea walks in, not with fire and thunder, but with relief. Imagine someone telling you the maze finally ends tonight. No more bills, no more apologies, no more choices. A single date circled in thick red ink, and every tangled thread of your life pulled tight and snipped clean. Psychologically, certainty promises safety, and when fear is loud, certainty feels like mercy. At the kitchen table, the woman and a few friends inventory what they no longer need. A bracelet for the charity box, the winter jacket for the shelter, the savings for the cause. "It will be over by sunrise," she whispers, as if volume could jinx it. Someone laughs to keep the mood from tipping into tears. Someone else says they have never felt so light. Without the burden of later, now becomes easy to give away. The group feels woven together by a deadline that erases tomorrow's doubts. In a world where meaning can be slippery, a clock with 1 hour left makes meaning solid, but that certainty has a twin. When a date rules your heart, everything outside of it becomes background noise. Family calling. They do not understand. A job asking you to stay. They cannot see. The group becomes the weather, the language, the map. If outsiders feel like a different planet, it is because belonging is powerful medicine, and groups built on shared urgency can feel like oxygen. Psychologically, that urgency amplifies cohesion. Shared countdowns bond people, and shared sacrifice proves the bond is real. Midnight, a field, a cluster of candles cupped in hands. The leader speaks softly about the storm and the shelter, about the page turning and the door opening. People murmur, eyes closed. A man gives his last coat to a shivering stranger at the edge of the circle, because the old rules still visit him in small ways. They wait together for the sky to break. Sunrise arrives with ordinary birds. Nothing ends. Nothing begins, at least not in the way they were promised. For a breath, there is silence. Then the human mind, ingenious, aching, starts to work. Maybe the prayer saved the world. Maybe the time was symbolic. Maybe the test was faith. It is not foolishness. It is a search for a story that can hold the weight of last night's generosity. When we invest ourselves completely, the gap between what we gave and what we got back hums like a live wire. To quiet it, we reach for a new explanation, a new deadline, a new red circle. If this sounds far away, look closer. The Doomsday pattern is not only about apocalypses and mountaintops. It lives wherever a promise of escape says, "Give up your agency and I will give you peace." It is not just fear of the world ending. It is hope that your confusion will end. It is not just a prophecy. It is a proposal. Hand me your choices, and I will hand you meaning. There is a different way to hear that proposal. Pause and ask simple questions with stubborn kindness. Who benefits when you surrender your tomorrow? What happens to your love if it must be proved by loss? Does purpose expire if there is no ticking clock? Questions like these do not break belonging. They strengthen it by rooting it in life that continues. That is the reframe, not rejecting togetherness, but choosing the kind that helps you live, not vanish. Not trading uncertainty for obedience, but trading isolation for honest community. Later that afternoon, the woman pulls a chair back inside. She calls her sister. She keeps the 2 mugs she almost gave away. There is no parade, there is no dramatic undoing. There is just the quiet, stubborn decision to reclaim a tomorrow. Meaning, it turns out, can be built without a deadline. Belonging, it turns out, can be measured in shared dinners and small kindnesses, not in what you leave behind. The most forbidden idea is not that the world could end. It is that you do not need an ending to begin again. Picture a room where the clocks have no hands, the lights never quite go dark, and every voice tells you the same story. That is how a mind starts to bend. Not with a single shocking moment, but with a slow, careful rearranging of what you see, what you hear, and what you believe about yourself. The word brainwashing sounds mystical, but it is mostly plumbing. Cults and states both learn to reroute the flow of attention. They narrow your world, then flood it. They confuse your senses, then offer a single shining certainty. They are not hunting your thoughts, they are hunting your patterns. Change the pattern and the person follows. It begins with space. Pull someone away from familiar rooms, familiar faces, familiar news. Take away the habits that anchor a day. Disconnect the phone. Shave down sleep. Change meal times. Keep them waiting. A tired body lets in ideas it would normally brush away. When your rhythm breaks, your judgment stumbles. Then comes warmth, poured like syrup. Love bombing. Smiles that never blink. A swarm of names and hands. You are special. You are chosen. You are finally seen. This is no accident. Belonging is the most powerful drug a social animal ever tasted. If you feel held, you will tolerate what you would once have run from. The warmth turns, as it must, because fear seals the bond. Rules appear you did not know you broke. The group corrects you. The leader scolds you. Shame is public. Praise is scarce, and both arrive without warning. Your nervous system learns to scan the room for safety, and the only safe thing is obedience. Intermittent reward is the hook you cannot see. Language tightens the cage. Complicated feelings are compressed into simple phrases, thought-terminating cliches, loaded words, catchy slogans that stick in your mouth like gum. If the words are small enough, the world becomes small enough to manage. Say a script often enough and it starts to feel like yours. Confession cements it. You tell them a secret, maybe a little one at first. They nod, they understand. Then bigger secrets come, drawn out by pressure or by comfort. Now the watcher is inside you. You police yourself, you police others, and the group calls it honesty. Guilt becomes a leash you learn to hold. Identity gets swapped for a uniform. A new name, a new chant, a new mission. Us and them. Saved and lost. Clean and dirty. It is not that your old self is wrong. It is that your old self is now treated as dangerous. And if a state wants the same outcome, it scales the ritual to the size of a stadium. Flags, anthems, marching feet. The echo of thousands makes a single voice sound divine. Information control does not always mean silence. Sometimes it means noise. Flood the senses with statements and stories and statistics until truth feels like a mirage. If nothing can be verified, then everything can be believed. When confusion is the climate, certainty becomes a product, and the one who sells certainty controls the weather. Underneath all of this is a simple trade. Surrender your story. Receive a purpose. The mind does not die, it is repurposed. The inner narrator that once said, "I am this kind of person," begins to say, "We are this kind of people." The private timeline gets overwritten by a shared calendar of holy days, heroic battles, and necessary enemies. A self shrinks, a role expands, and the person is praised for calling it freedom. Here is the forbidden idea behind the brainwashing idea. There is a recipe that can cook almost any mind if you control heat, time, and ingredients. That sounds bleak, but it points to another truth just as powerful. Every recipe can be spoiled. The same levers that move you are levers you can learn to see. Name the moves out loud. Isolation, sleep pressure, love bombing, loaded language, intermittent reward. Once a trick has a label, it cannot hide as easily. Seek a second source for any big claim, even if it is as simple as a dictionary, a calendar, an old friend who remembers who you were before this room. Guard your sleep like a passport. Eat when you can. Walk when you can. A rested brain is a stubborn brain. Ask for time. Real persuasion hates a pause. If a decision must be made right now, the decision is probably theirs, not yours. Keep a private ritual no one else owns. A song, a prayer, a journal, a smell from home tucked into a pocket. These are not sentimental extras. They are little bridges back to yourself. Hold on to your questions. Circular answers spin fast, but they do not go anywhere. If you are punished for asking why, you have learned something vital about who benefits from your silence. And remember that laughter is not trivial. Laughter unties the knot between fear and obedience. It reminds you that you can still see the edges of the frame. The people who bend minds are not wizards. They are engineers of attention and environment. They exploit our deepest needs for belonging, certainty, rhythm, and meaning. Those needs are not weaknesses. They are human. Keep them, but choose who gets to meet them. Keep your pattern, but make it yours. And if you find yourself in that room with no clocks and too much light, start with one quiet act of refusal. Tell yourself your real name and say it until the walls remember. A child once learned to read the language of machinery before learning the alphabet. The hiss that meant beware, the clatter that meant hurry, the whistle that meant your body is now a clock. In that world, childhood was not a season, it was a measurement of value. Small hands fit where adult hands could not. Light bodies could crawl under gears where grown bodies would jam. And so the idea took hold. The kind of idea people accept when their stomachs are empty, and the factory doors are the only doors that stay open. Children were sent to the machines as if they were wicks to be burned, as if the fire had a right to them. The morning bell did not ask if a child had slept. It did not ask if a child had dreamed. It simply called, and tiny feet answered because their parents were paid too little, because rent demanded its due, because a foreman smiled at the math of it all. The arithmetic was easy. Less pay, more hours, more profit. Press a boy into a corner with a broom and call him efficient. Send a girl to tie threads in a loom and call her nimble. The children learned the taste of lint and oil before the taste of warm breakfast. They learned to swallow smoke and keep moving. The story of progress was written in soot on their hands. Listen closely and you can hear the words that defended it. People said it was natural. People said a day inside the mill was better than a day in the street. People said a child must learn work early to avoid laziness later. Every sentence built a wall around a truth no one wanted to face. The work was crushing their bodies and shrinking their futures. Still, the belts turned. Still, the cogs ate time. Still, the light outside the windows crossed the sky without them. In that dark logic, a child was an interchangeable part. If one broke, the foreman would hire another. If a small shoulder got trapped beneath a belt, the line paused only long enough to clear the jam. The accident was not a story, it was a delay. Tiny lungs learned the weight of dust. Tiny backs learned to carry sacks heavier than names. And somewhere beyond the mills, adults sat at tables and congratulated themselves on rising output, on booming markets, on the visible signs of prosperity that shone brightest when you did not look too closely at who had polished them. But ideas invite their opposites. For every person who nodded at the math, someone else flinched at the cost. A neighbour saw a child stagger home and went to bed angry. A writer visited a mill and could not shake the clench in their chest. A mother washed a shirt that smelled of damp stone and hot metal and thought my child should smell of rain. Words began to form, words like cruelty and shame and theft, words that felt strange at first because they argued with the very ground people walked on. Those words asked a simple question with a dangerous edge. What is a childhood for? Slowly the answers changed. Schools whispered a new rhythm, one measured not by whistles, but by lessons and recess, and the miracle of unassigned hours. The idea that children are not raw material began to spread. It did not come easy. It met resistance, met laughter, met 1,000 excuses dressed in the costume of common sense. But it kept moving, carried by people who remembered that the young are not yet bargains to be struck, but promises to be kept. Laws followed, sometimes trailing far behind, sometimes sprinting to catch the moment when a society remembered its heart. The mills learned to hum without little bodies pressed close to their teeth. The streets learned the sound of games instead of marching feet at dawn. And yet, the echo remains. It deposits itself in the corners of our homes, in the labels stitched into our shirts, in the glow of the screens we hold close to our faces. When a price seems impossibly low, someone else is paying for the discount. When speed is the only measure, someone's time is being stolen. The child labour idea never disappears. It only changes its mask. It hides in long supply chains, in distant places we are asked not to picture, in words like necessary and competitive and efficient. It thrives where the hungry are told to be grateful, and where the comfortable are told not to ask questions. It waits in that quiet, hopeful space between what we promise and what we tolerate. So hold the image, a small hand reaching into a machine that can never love it back. Hold it when you buy, when you vote, when you praise productivity without asking for its cost. Hold it when you hear the old defences dressed up in new clothes. Because the measure of us is not how loudly our factories roar, but how gently our children sleep. The children who once learned the language of gears deserve a language of stories and songs, of classrooms and fields, of afternoons that unfold without a clock. Only when we guard that simple truth do we make an idea forbidden again, that any child anywhere can be treated as expendable. The first time you notice you're being watched, even a little, the room gets smaller. Your voice gets quieter, and some part of you starts editing itself before it even speaks. That's the heart of the total surveillance idea. Not just catching the worst among us, but shaping all of us. Build systems that assume everyone needs watching, and you change what people dare to do, say, and even dream. It sounds like security, it feels like control. And it works on the quietest level of all, inside your head. Picture a city block where the street lights double as eyes, cameras on corners, sensors in doorways, a microphone that is probably off, but maybe not. You are late, you cut through the alley, you rehearse your reason. Nothing happens. Still, you walk differently. The possibility of an audience edits your body. Now scale that feeling across your day. Your phone pings that an app is tracking location for your safety. Your job dashboard counts keystrokes to improve productivity. Your school login timestamps every click to ensure attendance. Each one sounds reasonable alone. Together, they become air. You forget you are breathing it, but your lungs remember. Here's a smaller scene. A manager wants to squeeze out wasted time, so they install a tool that screenshots workers' screens every few minutes. On day 1, people sit straighter. On day 2, they learn to wiggle the mouse. By week 2, nobody takes a real break because the gaps look suspicious. By month 2, projects are on schedule, but ideas are duller. No one asks the risky question, tries the weird prototype, or deletes the safe slide to make space for a better one. The work looks clean, the work feels smaller. And ironically, the manager now needs more monitoring because trust has been traded away for metrics. Or think about a classroom. A student knows the webcam is always on, the software flags eye movement, and the mic can listen for whispers. They are not cheating. They are nervous. They stare straight ahead, not because the lesson is captivating, but because looking away could look like guilt. When the test ends, it is not relief they remember. It is the feeling that every blink was an alibi. Surveillance sells itself as a shortcut to safety. The promise is simple. If we can see everything, we can stop the bad things before they start. But watching is not neutral. Watching is an intervention. Humans don't just behave, we perform. When the audience is assumed to be hostile, or at least unimpressed, we perform caution, we perform compliance, and over time, the performance becomes the person. Psychologically, constant observation shifts us from exploration to evaluation. Curiosity needs a little privacy. It needs rooms where a half-formed idea can stumble without a transcript, and corners where a new self can try on a voice that does not yet have evidence to defend it. When every corner is lit up, you get fewer experiments and more rehearsals. You get more proof and less discovery. And then systems look around and say, see, nothing unexpected happened, it must be working, which is exactly the problem. There is also the loop of suspicion. If you design a system that treats everyone as a potential risk, you will find more signals of risk. Ambiguity gets labelled as threat. Pauses look like evasions. A joke becomes a pattern. People adjust to dodge false flags, which creates new patterns that look even stranger, and soon the system is busy catching the shadows it casts. The net is full, the ocean is emptying, but there is a quieter cost. Communities knit themselves together with a kind of everyday faith, the faith that most people, left unwatched, will still try to do right most of the time. That faith gives us room to be generous with one another's mistakes, to forgive slow mornings and weird afternoons, and to believe that the benefit of the doubt is not a luxury, but a fuel. Replace that with default suspicion, and you don't just catch more errors, you also starve the soil that grows responsibility. People stop choosing the right thing because it is right, and start choosing the safe thing because it is safer. Here is the twist that makes this idea so seductive. Whenever something goes wrong, the solution that wins the meeting is almost always more watching. It is visible. It feels decisive. And if it fails, you can always say, it just wasn't enough. Meanwhile, the harder answer, designing for trust and accountability without the floodlights, is quieter, slower, and harder to count. So what do we do with an idea this powerful? We remember that security is not the same as certainty. We carve out deliberate pockets of unobserved space in our tools, schools, and workplaces, where people can test, learn, and be a little unpolished without earning a permanent mark. We measure outcomes more than optics. We build audit trails that are narrow and purposeful, not oceans we swim in every second. We teach that privacy is not something you use to hide. It is something you use to grow. The total surveillance idea says everyone needs to be watched. The counter idea says most people need to be trusted, and the few who break that trust can be handled without caging the rest. It is not naive to believe that. It is brave. Because trust, unlike surveillance, asks something of us. It asks us to see one another as more than data. It asks us to risk a little so something larger can exist. And if we want a world that invites boldness, we have to leave a few lights off. They built the smallest prison without walls. It lives behind the eyes. You can pace a room, cross a border, smile at a neighbour, and still feel the cuffs, not on your wrists, on your thoughts. The thought crime idea sounds absurd the first time you hear it. How can a feeling, a suspicion, a spark count as wrongdoing? But that is the point. When rulers decide that thinking can be illegal, they do not have to chase bodies. They just teach minds to chase themselves. Psychologically, Fear turns into an internal guard, and once that guard moves in, control scales without effort. Imagine a schoolroom where a teacher says, "You may learn every rule except the one that makes you ask why." A child raises a hand, then lowers it. No one scolds them, no one needs to. The rule has already been installed. Now imagine a workplace where someone glances at a blank message draft and whispers, "Do not write that." The pointer hovers, then clicks the little grey X. The words never exist, and somehow that is exactly the victory power wanted. This is the trick. Instead of punishing actions, the system convinces you to prefer silence. Not bars and batons, but shame and second guesses. Not force, but framing. Not cages, but beliefs. Tell people that a thought can make them dangerous, and they will live like a lit match could turn them to ash. After a while, you do not need to threaten them at all. The smallest flinch does the job. You can see how it spreads. A neighbour feels a surge of doubt and tucks it away. A student hides a banned book beneath a safer one. A parent cautions a teenager at the doorway. "Keep your head down." The teenager nods, steps outside, and trades curiosity for camouflage. We can picture it. A notebook, a paused pen, a closed window, a mind choosing a safer sentence and then choosing nothing at all. But here is the danger behind the danger. When ideas are outlawed, they do not die. They learn to whisper. They move underground, growing dense and pressurized, until one day they ignite. History repeats a simple pattern. Forbid a question, and you wrap it in myth. Shame a thought, and you gift it a sharper edge. People learn to speak in code. They invent metaphors that curve around the ban. They laugh at the wrong moment and can never fully explain why. The soul keeps looking for air. There is another layer too. Thought crime collapses the difference between doubt and treason. If a leader can label a private hesitation as disloyal, then every honest appraisal feels like a trap. So you avoid accuracy. You avoid honesty. You avoid the part of you that wonders aloud. The result is a society running on staged agreement. It looks orderly, it sounds loyal, but it is brittle. One surprise, and it cracks. So how do people resist a rule that lives in their heads? Not by pretending they are fearless. Fear is human. Resistance begins with reclaiming ordinary freedoms that thought crime tries to make suspicious. The freedom to pause before you repeat a slogan. The freedom to ask, what if both things are true? The freedom to keep a private journal and let it be messy. The freedom to say, I do not know yet, and mean it. Psychologically, giving yourself permission to wonder creates safety for your own mind, which is the only place any true liberty starts. There is power in small, unremarkable acts. Two friends agree to argue in good faith, even about the sacred cows. It lowers defences. It builds trust. It grows courage in increments. A teacher assigns comparisons instead of conclusions. A manager invites a dissenting view and actually uses it. Each of these is modest. Each chips away at the invisible bars. Notice the contrast. Not contempt, but curiosity. Not purity tests, but principled debate. Not unanimity, but integrity of thought. And yes, there are moments to speak plainly. There are times when the whisper needs to be a bell, but most days the work looks quieter. Guard how you label your own ideas. When the voice in your head says, "Careful, that thought is dangerous," ask, "Dangerous to whom?" Protect the slow questions, the awkward drafts, the unready sentences. Leave space for the version of you that is not certain yet. In that space, your mind stops acting like a police officer and remembers it is a citizen. One last picture. A person sits at a table with a worn notebook. They take a breath and write a sentence they have been avoiding. Nothing explodes. No siren sounds. The dog across the street barks once and then sleeps. The world does not end. But for that person, something else ends. The spell that said a thought could make them a criminal. The spell that said a question could make them unworthy. They close the notebook and carry an unseen key. The smallest prison has no walls. That is also why it has so many exits. Use the ones within reach. Build the ones you cannot find. Then share them. This is how the fear loses its job, how control loses its leverage, and how a forbidden idea becomes a free one, by changing the frame, adding courage in small circles, and ending with a clear human truth that echoes long after the last word. A clipboard, a stamped form, a gentle voice saying, "This is for the greater good." That's how tidy some of the darkest ideas look when they first arrive. Clean, official, helpful. And for a time, people believed that controlling who could have children was not only sensible but compassionate. They called it improvement. They called it mercy. They said it would spare future suffering. Meanwhile, thousands lost the most intimate choice a person can have. Imagine being led down a hallway that smells like antiseptic and new paint. A nurse smiles, a door clicks shut, and the language is careful and soft. This will help your family. You won't have to worry. Everyone will be safer. If you hesitate, there is a doctor with a certificate on the wall and a law on the books. If you ask questions, there are charts and categories. Fit and unfit, sound and unsound. The labels become boxes, and once you are placed in a box, the decision feels inevitable. That is how an ordinary building becomes a machine. Psychologically, the promise of a single clean solution to a messy problem is magnetic. It feels safe. It lowers our anxiety to believe that a complex world can be fixed with one decisive policy, especially when that policy is framed as protection. We are drawn to certainty, to authority, to the feeling that we have acted responsibly. But safety without consent is not safety. It is control. And control that overrides autonomy does not heal a society. It hollows it out from within. When people lose the right to decide what happens to their bodies, the harm does not stop at one person. It reverberates into families, neighborhoods, and history, leaving silence where futures might have grown. The story we were told was simple. Prevent hardship before it starts. And who wouldn't want to reduce suffering? But the story left out what always gets left out when power speaks softly. The people it would affect, and what they wanted. It left out the reality that intelligence cannot be seen in a glance, that struggle is not a defect, that worth is not measured on a clipboard. It ignored how fear and prejudice masquerade as pragmatism. It turned difference into defect, and gave defect a legal pathway. Here is the hardest part to admit. Many of the people who supported these policies thought of themselves as humane. They were teachers and jurists and caretakers who believed they were preventing pain. That is why this idea kept momentum. It felt like compassion while erasing the very people it claimed to protect. A belief can be both polished and cruel. A procedure can be both routine and devastating. A signature can be both legal and wrong. We need a reframe that holds in any era, not progress that narrows who counts, but progress that expands who belongs. Not improvement that trims the human tree from the top down, but improvement that tends the soil, education, healthcare, choice and support, so everything has a chance to grow. When we aim for outcomes by removing people's agency, we gamble with our humanity. When we aim for outcomes by investing in people's agency, we multiply it. Psychologically, when folks feel seen and respected, they cooperate, contribute, and heal. Dignity is not a luxury. It is the engine of durable change. If you want a simple test for any big, shiny idea that promises a better tomorrow, try this. Ask who loses a say. Ask who is spoken for. Ask whether the path forward requires silence from the very people living the consequences. If the answer is yes, the idea is not progress. It is an old habit in a new coat. There is a softer way to ensure fewer children suffer, and it does not require deciding who is worthy. It looks like giving parents stability, giving communities resources, and giving young people real choices. It looks like informed consent, not coerced compliance. It looks like listening first, then building with, not on each other. It is slower. It is messier. It does not fit neatly in a single policy or a single decade, but it leaves something precious intact, the human capacity to choose. Picture the clipboard again. It can be an instrument of harm, or it can be a checklist for care. It can tally who gets excluded, or it can track which clinics need funding, which schools need support, which families need time and space. The difference is not the paperwork, it is the principle underneath. The idea that sterilization served the greater good did change the world, but through loss, grief, and a long shadow of distrust. What we do with that memory is up to us. We can learn to recognize when certainty starts to speak in the language of compassion while pushing consent out of the room. We can learn to ask better questions before good intentions harden into harmful rules. And we can learn to measure progress not by how much control we can impose, but by how much dignity we can protect. A stranger cups your skull like a crystal ball, then promises your future is hiding in the bumps. He slides cold brass along your temple, consults a parchment map of the mind, and declares you brave, or lazy, or destined to lead. That was the spell of phrenology, a promise that character could be read like topography. The idea sounded wonderfully tidy. If the brain holds our thoughts and feelings, and the skull holds the brain, then surely the skull must reveal a map of who we are. So they drew that map. They carved the mind into dozens of tidy regions with confident names. A nook for benevolence, a ridge for combativeness, a valley for love of children. With calipers and charts, they measured heads in parlours and in prisons, in drawing rooms and on docks, all to weigh invisible morals in ounces of bone. It looked like science because it wore the costume. There were instruments, measurements, lecture tours, and handsome diagrams. People sat still while experts traced their contours and spoke with the certainty of astronomers. Parents sought readings for their children. Employers asked for assessments. Lovers compared profiles. It felt rational, modern, humane even, because it claimed to replace superstition with measurement. What could be more enlightened than replacing guesswork with numbers? But under the tinted glow, phrenology did something older and darker. It took the messy wonder of human beings and flattened us into scores. Those scores became tools of power. If the skull could rank virtues, it could rank peoples. It offered rulers and would-be scientists a simple chart to justify their prejudices. If one group measured a little less conscientious, that might explain why they should work for others. If another measured more aggressive, that might explain why they needed discipline. Prisons and asylums welcomed the tidy responsibility of the cranium. If a person misbehaved, blame the bump. Schools used it to stream children toward futures they did not choose. Doctors, officials, and travelling examiners carried this portable certainty to faraway lands and used it to rationalise conquest as therapy. You can see why it spread. It was a mirror that flattered those already in charge. It told a thrilling story that fate is legible, that virtue can be weighed, that society simply obeys the geometry of our heads. And it offered comfort to the anxious heart. If your child was restless, perhaps a little extra reading could fortify the organ of self-control. If your boss doubted your diligence, you could point to a chart and a measurement and call it proof. Yet the skull does not reveal the mind. Bones do not etch kindness into peaks or stamp cruelty into hollows. The brain is exquisitely complex, alive, adaptive, and it does not press its moral script through the skull like embossed paper. The phrenologists were not discovering truth so much as reflecting back what they already believed. Their instruments could not protect them from bias. Their charts offered the illusion of precision, and they mistook agreement among themselves for evidence. What makes the phrenology idea powerful and dangerous is not only that it was wrong, but that it was seductive. It offered a shortcut through uncertainty. It replaced the hard work of listening and changing with a gaze and a measurement. And like many neat stories, it was hard to let go. Even as critics raised doubts, the practice adapted. The labels softened, the claims narrowed, but the hunger for a quick verdict remained. We have not outgrown that hunger. Today, it wears new clothes. Sometimes it waves a brain scan like a verdict, as if a coloured blot could speak for a whole life. Sometimes it hides in a predictive score that promises to forecast a student's future, or a worker's honesty, or a stranger's risk. Sometimes it peers at a face and insists it can see intent. The danger is not only in the tool, but in the leap from measurement to meaning, from likelihood to law, from correlation to destiny. There is a better instinct to nourish. It starts with humility. Measure carefully, interpret gently, and ask who benefits from the chart. Refuse to let rulers become judges of worth. Reclaim the slow questions. What happened in a person's life? What opportunities were offered or withheld? What choices were possible? The shape of a head will not answer these. Neither will a single score. The old dream of reading souls from skulls has passed into curiosity, but its echo lingers whenever we turn to tidy numbers to absolve ourselves of thinking and care. The lesson is not to abandon science, but to insist that science be joined with ethics and history and doubt. Let our tools illuminate, not incarcerate. Let our curiosity be matched by compassion. And when a confident voice presses cold metal against what makes us human, let us remember how easily a neat idea can harden into a cage, and how much wiser we become when we choose to see people, not measurements. A ledger, a ruler, and a heartbeat. That is how some tried to solve the human race. Add the numbers, trim the excess, and call it order. It sounds tidy, it feels rational, but the moment a life becomes a line on a graph, compassion starts slipping off the page. Population control was sold as a cure for hunger, poverty, and unrest, a neat fix for messy realities. The sales pitch went like this: resources are finite, people are multiplying, and math does not care about mercy. If you accept that premise, then harshness begins to look like wisdom. The spreadsheet becomes a moral shield. Someone somewhere whispers that nature is cold, so policy must be colder. And so the first cut is made. That cut has a history. Long before clinics and quotas, officials spoke of the poor as too numerous for their own good. They blamed empty stomachs on crowded rooms instead of empty coffers or empty promises. In faraway provinces and crowded cities, relief was delayed or denied because hunger, they insisted, would teach restraint. Treating famine as a lesson is the oldest cruelty dressed up as prudence. Then came the clinic. Eugenics claimed it could refine society like a gardener pruning a tree. The labels were slippery words like unfit or feeble-minded, usually stamped on the vulnerable, the poor, the disabled, and those who did not belong to the right language, skin, or faith. Consent often meant a signature taken under threat or in confusion. Futures were snipped without the person ever understanding why their body suddenly carried a locked door. For many, the scar was invisible but lifelong. No lullabies, no names chosen, no hand to guide across a busy street. In the name of development, governments learned to count wombs. Targets were set, bonuses offered. The line between choice and coercion dissolved at the point of a needle or the pressure of a clipboard at the doorstep. In crowded wards, lit by buzzing bulbs, whole rows of beds filled with people who thought they had come for help and left with something gone. Families carried shame, anger, and questions that had no gentle answer. When the state decides your family size, your home becomes an annex of the office. The most famous program turned the family into a permit. One pregnancy was encouraged. The next became a problem to be corrected. Bureaucracy grew a moral vocabulary. Unauthorized, over quota, non-compliant. Behind those words were whispered stories of late-night knocks, of hidden births, of daughters unrecorded and sons preferred. A policy meant to stabilize the future shook its foundations by warping the balance of boys and girls, by aging a nation before it became prosperous, by teaching citizens to fear the very people who kept their papers. Elsewhere, the scale was smaller, but the pain just as deep. Rural women were told a procedure was just routine. Men were promised benefits that never came. Indigenous communities woke to find that their reproduction had been measured without their permission. Decades later, apologies tried to stitch up wounds that policy had sliced open. But apologies do not hold babies that never arrived. They do not return the trust stolen from a doctor's white coat. The cruelest part is how sensible it all pretended to be. Less poverty if fewer mouths, they said. But people are not mouths alone. They are hands that build, minds that imagine, hearts that care for the young and the old. When you reduce a person to consumption, you erase their capacity to create. The ledger misses the inventions, the crops coaxed from stubborn soil, the songs that carry a community through hardship, the quiet persistence that turns scarcity into ingenuity. There is a different lesson tucked inside the ruins. When women and men have access to education, to healthcare, to contraception, they can choose freely. And to futures worth planning for, birth rates fall by choice, not force. When a child survives, a parent can imagine a smaller family without fear. When rights expand, coercion becomes unnecessary. Freedom accomplishes what control could only imitate with violence. None of this denies that the planet has limits. It simply insists that human dignity is not a variable to be minimized. When fear of numbers meets the machinery of the state, suffering blooms. When we chase simplified solutions to complex problems, we end up solving the wrong equations. The soil of injustice is always the same: impatience, certainty, and the willingness to sacrifice someone else's tomorrow for our comfort today. So remember the quiet costs: a name never given, a lullaby unsung, a grandmother who never became one. Policies fade and targets are rewritten, but silence lingers in homes where a life was prevented not by choice, but by force. The idea of controlling population promised order. It delivered grief. And it left us with a truth we keep learning the hard way. Any vision of the future that asks us to harm people in the present will always be too small for the world we deserve. Start with a whisper and watch a bonfire. One person leans in and says, "What if the sacred rule is wrong?" The room goes still. The air tightens. Hearts pound. Not because the idea is evil, but because ideas this charged can light everything. For a long time, asking that question was not a debate. It was a sentence. To doubt the doctrine, to test a tradition, to hold a mirror to power, was to step outside the warm circle of belonging. The label for that exile was heretic. And yet, look at history with honest eyes and you find a strange pattern. The same spark that threatened the order also became the seed for reform, art, science, and new kinds of freedom. Here is the heresy idea. The boundaries of belief are not cages to protect truth. They are fences that must be pushed to keep truth alive. Not rebellion for rebellion's sake, but a deeper loyalty to what is real. Not disrespect, but devotion so strong it refuses to lie. Picture a cold room, late at night. A scholar bends over a page, ink staining fingers, copying a line that challenges the sanctioned line. The door could burst open. The page could be burned. Still the hand continues. Not because the scholar wants chaos, but because they want clarity. The forbidden thought is a lantern, not a torch. It shows the cracks nobody wants to see in daylight, or bring it closer. A child around a table asks a simple, dangerous question. But what if they are wrong? The adults trade glances. Someone coughs. Someone changes the subject. The child has tugged a thread, and everyone felt the tension in their own chest. We all know that feeling. We know the quiet calculation. Is this worth it? Do we keep the peace or protect the truth? Psychologically, dissent scares us because groups survive by harmony. To the nervous system, disagreement can feel like a threat. But when people feel safe enough to be heard first, defenses drop and curiosity returns. Understanding creates space for better ideas to enter. That is why heresy, in the best sense, asks not for outrage, but for room. The room to wonder aloud without being thrown to the wolves. There is a cost, of course. The cost used to be measured in flames and chains. Today, it often looks like social exile, lost opportunities, whispers behind closed doors. The form changes, but the pressure is the same. Stay quiet. Smile along. Do not test what keeps us comfortable. The heresy idea answers, gently but firmly. Comfort is not the same as truth. We can practice the courage of heresy without cruelty. Start by naming what is sacred about the thing you question. Honour the intention behind the rule. Then ask the question that will not leave you alone. Notice how you want to rush to a verdict, and instead hold the uncertainty like you would hold a fragile cup. Psychologically, creating this kind of safety lowers defences and opens a path to honest thought. The goal is not to win a duel, it is to let reality speak. In that light, the heretic is not a villain. The heretic is the person willing to say, if the truth is strong, it can endure my question. The heretic is the early smoke alarm, the stress test, the one who rattles the gate before the bridge collapses. Not the destroyer of faith, but its caretaker. A faith, a philosophy, a community that cannot bear a question is not sturdy. It is brittle. What breaks under a question was already cracked. Consider how art grows, how science changes, how relationships deepen. It is rarely through perfect agreement. It is usually through friction handled with grace. A painter defies the canon. A researcher challenges an elegant theory that does not match the data. A friend says, "I love you, and we cannot keep pretending this is working." Each is a small act of heresy. Each bends the arc towards something more honest. There is a way to do this that does not scorch the earth. Lead with humility. Ask for the strongest version of the belief you are testing. Listen long enough to understand why it matters. Then offer the question that kept you up at night. This is not defiance as performance. This is devotion to reality delivered with care. When people feel seen, they are more open to the conversation that follows. The fire becomes light, not just heat. If you inherited a map that no longer fits the territory, there is no virtue in pretending the mountains are still where they were. Name what has shifted. Draw a new line. Not because you despise the old map, but because you respect the journey. So, yes, once upon a time, challenging religion meant risking your life. Today, the stakes can still feel existential, but the quiet courage behind the heresy idea is the same as it ever was. Love the truth enough to ask for it. Protect the people, even as you press the boundaries. Let the question breathe, and let the answer take the time it needs. Start with a whisper. A gentle, honest one. Then watch how a bonfire becomes a beacon. A glass of water no one is allowed to stir sounds clean, but it is not the way life tastes. That is the seduction of the race purity idea, a promise of clarity that quietly drains the colour from human beings. It says difference is danger, mixture is mistake, and lines on paper should be treated like laws of nature. It sounds orderly. It turns cruel very quickly. The story always begins gently. A phrase at a dinner table. A joke about keeping the blood pure. A shrug that says that is just how things are. You have seen the way people lean in when a simple rule promises safety. We all like simple. Our brains love neat categories, shortcuts, certainty. But when a category becomes a cage, someone ends up locked inside it and someone else is given the key. Here is the hard part. Purity sounds moral because it borrows the language of cleanliness. It makes compassion feel like contamination. If you repeat that logic, small exclusions feel responsible. Then forms appear. Measurements, ledgers, checkpoints. A neighbour is told their love is illegal. A child is asked to prove a fraction. A family learns that their home sits on the wrong side of a line someone else drew. The obsession with purity gives ordinary hands extraordinary permission. Let's flip the script. What if the opposite of purity is not decay, but depth? Not chaos, but connection? What if mixture is not a flaw to be scrubbed out, but the very fabric that keeps cultures alive? That is the reframe that breaks the spell. We are not vessels to be kept clear. We are a mosaic that becomes stronger as more pieces find their place. Consider a quieter scene. A teacher hears a student say, "My background is complicated." The easy response is to smooth it out, to ask for the nearest single label. Instead, the teacher says, "Tell me the long version." Faces change when the long version is welcomed. Roommates who used to tense up at different traditions begin swapping recipes. Colleagues who once whispered about last names start asking about grandparents and the roots that brought them here. When complexity is allowed, empathy grows. When empathy grows, cruelty struggles to breathe. Psychologically, purity stories feel safe because they reduce uncertainty. They give the illusion of control by shrinking the world to us and them. But that shortcut comes at a cost. It narrows perception, amplifies threat responses, and numbs curiosity. The more a group repeats a purity rule, the more brittle its identity becomes, and the more it must police, punish, and purge to keep the illusion intact. That is why simple slogans can spiral into systems. That is why gentle beginnings can justify atrocities. The remedy is not to deny our need for belonging, but to widen it, to build identities that can stretch, absorb, and include without tearing. So what do we do in the space of a day, in the reach of one voice? We start small and stubborn. We notice where a category asks us to stop seeing, and we keep looking anyway. We replace purity tests with better questions. Instead of asking, "What are you?" we ask, "Who are you becoming?" Instead of guarding borders around identity, we build bridges around stories. We treat ancestry not as a ledger to be audited, but as a river, with many tributaries feeding it. We practice this in conversations, in classrooms, in hiring and in housing, in rituals and in laws. We measure success by how many people can breathe inside the circle. If you have ever been told you do not fit, you know the wound purity leaves. If you have ever felt the twitch to draw a stricter line, you know the temptation it offers. Both are human. What matters is which one we reinforce. When we choose wholeness over purity, we do not blur differences. We honour them without turning them into weapons. We are not erasing identity. We are letting it grow up. Remember the water we were not allowed to stir. Now picture light pouring through stained glass, every shard held by the lid between them. The pattern only appears because nothing is pure. That is the point to carry forward. Circle back to it when a simple rule tries to flatten a human life. Stir. Ask for the long version. Make space where a line used to be. That is how an old idea loses its hold and how a better one takes root. They wrapped progress in a cloud the colour of sour apples and asked the wind to deliver it. Imagine that. Not a sword, not a rifle, but a gas that could flow through alleys, slide under doors, and turn a city into a coughing, blinded chorus. There was a moment in the early 20th century when this was not just a nightmare. It was advertised as modern, scientific, efficient. Chemists had already promised miracles. They pulled nitrogen from the sky and fed fields that had starved for centuries. If they could conjure bread from air, they could surely conjure victory. So the pitch was simple. Why tear bodies apart with iron when you could put your enemy to sleep with a mist? Why smash a city when you could make it surrender with a breath? Smooth, clinical, almost humane, some experts said, as if war could be laundered in a laboratory. Then the wind answered. A pale cloud crept over trenches and lungs turned to water. Eyes burned. Voices rose into a wet rattle. Even the survivors carried the ghost of it afterward, in each shallow breath and each night that tasted like metal. But the idea held on. If gas could break armies in the open, why not break the will of entire populations? Imagine fleets of aircraft carried not bombs, but canisters. Imagine streets lined with canopies of vapour. Imagine a city, any city, brought to its knees by silence and fog. There were pamphlets that called gas the clean weapon. There were lectures that said, if we can make war terrible enough, we might end it faster. Science, they argued, would not only sharpen the sword, it could also shorten the fight. And for a little while, people believed. Engineers drafted maps of ventilation, flow rates, and ideal weather. Urban planners sketched shelters, with filters and doors that sealed like submarine hatches. Factories pressed out masks by the million. Parents tested little rubber hoods on their children, tiny faces peering through clear portholes, while a neighbour pumped air with a hand bellows. Whole cities rehearsed the future. Sirens wailed, windows went dark. Sandbags appeared like new architecture. Schools practiced filing into basements, the quiet punctured only by the hiss of imagined cylinders. Newspapers printed cutaway diagrams of filters, as if they were household appliances. You could be safe, they suggested, if you learned the right steps and kept your kit by the door. That was the promise of the chemical age. Control. A valve here, a mask there, and even the air could be managed, but the air does not bargain. On battlefields, gas turned out to be a sloppy partner. It would drift back when the wind shifted, or dissolve in rain, or pool where it was not expected. It spared no one who breathed, whether soldier or farmer. And when armies realized their own troops might be trapped by the same fog, they learned the old truth anew. War eats its inventors. Even so, the dream of citywide poisoning kept going, pushed by strategists who wanted shortcuts, and by empires that imagined distant towns as laboratories. In colonies far from the capitals that funded them, canisters fell on villages with names most citizens would never hear. There, the fantasy of clean victory turned to burns that never healed and fields that grew quiet. The idea wrote itself onto soil and skin. It shed the white coat and put on a uniform. And as it did, an equal and opposite movement began to take shape. Anger, shame, and the hard lesson that not every innovation deserves a blueprint. Rules followed, the kind written after someone has already bled. Treaties swore off the use of these weapons, even as warehouses held onto them like bad habits. Scientists spoke up. Some who had once argued that gas could be merciful watched their own data walk across a hospital ward and changed their minds. Others, stubborn or afraid, kept finding new names for old poisons, a dance of denial that the air itself refused to join. The idea had promised precision. It delivered panic. It promised progress. It delivered masks and sirens and a generation that feared a breeze. It promised a humane shortcut. It delivered a longer road, paved with new rules and a deeper, slower suspicion of anything that claimed to make killing gentle. And yet, in that wreckage, something durable emerged. The world learned to say no, not only to what weapons do, but to what they insist they are. We learned to hear the sales pitch in the smooth words, efficient, modern, humane. We learn to ask the only question that matters when an innovation knocks on the door of power: who breathes the cost? Stand for a moment with the citizens who once kept a mask by the bed and a wet cloth by the sink. Hear the siren drills, the practiced calm, the faith in filters. Then imagine opening a window after the treaty ink dried, letting in a draft that smelled like rain and cobblestone, and deciding that not all progress deserves to be inhaled. The chemical warfare idea tried to sell us a future where the atmosphere served as a weapon. We chose, imperfectly and late, to hold the breath of humanity above the thrill of a shortcut. The cloud taught us. The wind remembers. And the next time an invention promises a cleaner cruelty, perhaps we will remember too. Listen for a moment to a silence that feels like thunder, a crowd holding its breath, the air heavy with incense, eyes lifted to a sky that refuses to answer until a life is given. That is where the idea begins. Not with cruelty, not with chaos, but with a promise. If you give what is most precious, the world will keep spinning, the rains will return, the sun will rise again. Happiness and harvest are not accidents. They are payments made on time. To the people who believed it, killing was not a crime but a contract. It was a sacred duty, because the gods were imagined as creditors and caretakers, power and love wrapped together in a story too big to argue with. In this story, the universe runs on exchange. You take from the gods every hour you breathe, so you owe them back. When famine comes, the debt climbs. When an enemy army appears at the border, the debt doubles. And when the sky burns red at dusk, that is not just beauty. It is a reminder that blood is the only language the heavens will not ignore. Priests wore the weight of that duty. Their robes, their chants, their knives and cords and bowls were not instruments of sadism, but of service. Imagine standing in their place, told since childhood that you are the hinge between your people and the abyss. Imagine the trembling hands that must not tremble. The community watching, not because they delight in death, but because they fear what happens if the ritual fails. The child or captive or volunteer carries more than a life. They carry the hope of a whole valley. Everyone is trying to keep the story of tomorrow alive. Across mountains and coasts and islands, the details shifted, but the logic held. Some built altars on high peaks where the wind turned breath to frost, as if the gods could be reached more quickly there. Others fought ritual wars, not to conquer land, but to capture bodies for offerings, because the calendar was a drumbeat that demanded regular sacrifice. In some cities, legends tell of fires kept burning as insurance against the anger of unseen powers. Whether or not each tale is true, the shape of belief is clear. The world is dangerous, and meaning is the life raft. You cling to what saves you, even if it hurts. It is easy, from a safe distance, to condemn. But this idea did not survive because people loved violence. It survived because it gave a blueprint for order when chaos seemed to rule. It gave rulers a tool for binding the people to the state and the gods. And it gave the people a way to believe they had agency over drought and disease. It made suffering feel like an investment, not a waste. When the rains finally came, when the corn sprouted, who could say the ritual had failed? The success of the season became evidence that the debt was paid. There is a darker power in calling something sacred. It rearranges the compass of the heart. Acts that would be unbearable alone become bearable together, wrapped in rhythm, costume, drums, and smoke. The ritual divides a community's empathy, focusing tenderness on the future and withholding it from the present. The participants do not feel like killers. They feel like guardians, even martyrs. The victim is transformed into a bridge, a key, a gift. People can endure almost anything if they believe it saves those they love. But ideas evolve. New prophets whisper that the gods desire mercy, not blood. New empires centralize violence and call it justice instead of worship. Animals replace humans on the altar. Grain replaces animals. Words replace grain. The ritual remains, thinner and cleaner, until the memory of the knife is only a shadow. Outsiders brand the old ways barbaric. Insiders slowly agree, relieved to trade a red debt for a white one of fasting, prayer, and service. The moral map flips. What was once holy becomes unthinkable. If this idea shocks us now, it should also warn us. The line between duty and harm is easier to cross when the harm wears the costume of salvation. We no longer build stone altars in the square, but we still offer up lives to distant causes. We ask strangers to risk themselves for flags and borders, to exhaust themselves for growth and glory, to disappear into the machinery of progress. We cover these asks in noble words, because noble words make the pain make sense. We call it necessary. We call it brave. We call it inevitable, and sometimes we are right. Often we do not even ask who decided. The human sacrifice idea changed the world by teaching a terrible lesson. If you can convince a people that life is a currency, you can buy almost anything. Seasons of plenty, unified nations, grand monuments, glorious myths, but also silence around the cost. To honour the past without repeating it, we have to keep asking one stubborn question. What do we worship? And what do we place on the altar to feed it? Look around. The altars today are not stone. They glow behind glass, tick inside balance sheets, march in parades, hum in laboratories. They promise safety, prosperity, belonging. They promise a future, and every promise has a price. The duty now is not to refuse all sacrifice, but to refuse the ones that swallow people whole in the name of a God that never has to answer. They never pull the sound from the room all at once. They twist the dial a little and tell you the quiet is good for you. That is how the censorship idea sells itself. Not as a lock, not as a gag, but as a warm blanket. For stability, they say, to keep the streets calm, to keep the neighbours friendly, to keep the ship steady. And who could be against steadiness? Stability feels like safety until you notice your feet are not allowed to move. The script is old. A pamphlet is called dangerous, so it disappears for the health of the town. A song is called provocative, so it is shelved for the comfort of the audience. A question is called divisive, so it is discouraged for the unity of the group. Stability. Where the word sits, a boundary soon follows. But listen closely to how stability is used. It rarely means the kind of balance you build together, brick by brick. It means do not rock the platform someone else is standing on. It means let the river stop moving because the boatman is tired. It means the rule is more important than the reason the rule exists. It sounds soothing, but it smuggles in the idea that your voice is a risk and silence is a virtue. The irony is that the loudest eruptions usually do not come from noisy rooms. They come from rooms where whispers have been trapped for too long. When people are told their words are too sharp for the air, they sharpen them in private. Ideas that are buried do not decompose, they ferment. And then, one day, the jar breaks. Think about the moments when the world took a different turn. A scientist dared to write what the sky actually did. A woman stood up and asked why a rule book written by men should determine her future. A preacher said the chains on one person were a blemish on every soul. A student questioned a war. A worker asked to be paid for the worth of a day. Each time there was a chorus from the stage. Not now, not here, not so loud. They said the city would not hold together. They said the markets would panic. They said the children would be confused. They said the great house of civilization needed quiet halls. Yet the foundations did not crack when the truth was spoken clearly. They settled. The noise did not bring chaos. It brought fresh air into stale rooms. The world did not end. It changed. Censorship, dressed as stability, is built on a fragile assumption that people cannot handle tension. But tension is not a flaw in human life. It is proof that people care enough to pull in different directions. A bridge without tension falls. A society without disagreement becomes either brittle or numb. Stability is not silence. Real stability is that deep breath before a hard conversation, where everyone knows they will be heard and also challenged. There is a story they do not tell when they praise the muzzle. They do not tell you that every time a new voice was quieted, the ground under the old voices grew thinner. You can hold down the lid for only so long before your hands get tired. And when the lid finally lifts, the steam scalds everyone. A healthier kitchen opens the pot a little, stirs, adjusts, tastes, learns. The censorship idea thrives on the fear that the worst words will win if they are allowed to be said. But unchallenged, bad ideas rot in the dark and release their poison slowly. In the light, they invite rebuttal, context, empathy, and sometimes the hard admission that we were the ones missing something. That is how wisdom grows, not by pruning every branch that sticks out, but by shaping the tree as it finds the sun. Ask the questions the chorus avoids. If silence is for stability, stability for whom? If the voice is too sharp, sharp compared to what? If the risk is division, do we accept a false unity made of suppressed differences? What is the cost of a peace that asks us not to think? What kind of order survives only if it cannot be examined? If the answer is that your curiosity is a threat, then the threat is not you. It is a fear that the house was built without nails. None of this means anything goes. Responsibilities matter. Words can wound. But the remedy for harm is not a thick hush. It is clarity. It is more precise speech. It is standards applied openly, not thumbs pressed silently on scales. It is the confidence that a community strong enough to raise babies, bury elders, build roads, and create art can also host arguments without losing its soul. When someone tells you the break is necessary for balance, watch their hands. Are they using the language of care to protect power? Are they asking for quiet to spare feelings or to spare scrutiny? Are they defending the common good or the convenience of the current arrangement? Stability should be a promise that the floor will not collapse while we talk. If it becomes the reason we never talk, it is not stability anymore. It is a lullaby sung over a locked door. Turn the dial back up. Let the room have its sound. Let the careful voices and the clumsy ones meet. Let the brave ideas and the mistaken ones face each other and learn their boundaries. If there is a rule that cannot survive a question, it is not a rule worth keeping. If there is a truth that requires your silence to hold, it is not truth. And if the only way to keep the peace is to make everyone small, then it is not peace at all. It is just the quiet before the change. They promised us a quiet garden, and they handed us a marching drum. That is how the idea slips in. War will make us safe. War will cleanse our troubles. War will bind us into one unbreakable people. It sounds like a contradiction, and that is why it works. Say it enough times, and the mind smooths its edges until it feels like common sense. War is peace. Peace requires protection. Protection requires war. The circle closes, and the boots begin to move. The pitch is always elegant. Order out of chaos. Strength out of softness. A broken world reset by a glorious trial. It flatters us with a role in a grand story. It tells the lonely that they will march with brothers. It tells the anxious that their fear has a purpose. It tells the aimless that someone has drawn a straight line through their days and called it duty. A uniform is a costume for certainty, and certainty is a powerful drug. Language does most of the lifting. We are not bombing, we are securing. We are not invading, we are stabilizing. There are not bodies, there is collateral damage. Even the word theatre makes death sound like a rehearsal. The words get cleaner as the reality gets dirtier. The slogans grow shorter as the trenches grow longer. The fantasy becomes a mirror that reflects only our preferred angles. Then the drumbeat widens. Pictures of shining medals, parades that look like the future marching forward, hymns that glow with promise. The newspapers carry maps with tidy lines that erase mothers' names. Sermons offer moral clarity that fits in the space between breaths. Look how tight the story is. Look how good it feels to be on the side of history that wins. The side that saves, the side that finally makes the mess simple. The belief that war is good is a gate disguised as a banner. Pass under it and you join a rhythm. The rhythm is older than memory. It tells you that sacrifice is beautiful, so long as it is someone else's name on the list. It assures you that the first strike will be the last. It promises a short storm and a long summer. And while you wait for the picnic, the ration book arrives. Why do so many intelligent people walk through that gate? Because war answers questions that peace refuses to simplify. Who are we? The story says we are the brave who stood up. Why are we suffering? The story says it is their fault. How do we repair a broken economy, a wounded identity, a frayed community? The story says we heat the metal, we hammer it, we quench it, and what comes out is pure. Peace demands patience. War offers a timer. Fear is the other hand on your back. A threat outside can organize a nation inside. Fear can make curfews feel like comfort, and surveillance feel like a hug. The more we fear, the more we forgive. The more we forgive, the more the exception becomes the rule. Soon, the normal state of things is alarms and flags, and anyone who asks for quiet is accused of disloyalty. There is also the theatre of usefulness. Factories switch on. Jobs appear like ghosts in the smoke. New machines roll from assembly lines. And politicians point and say, "Look, see, the engine is roaring again." Count the wages and the contracts, and the cost begins to look like a ledger that might even balance. But you cannot balance a ledger with names. You cannot make a profit on grief. When the lights go off and the streets fall silent, the bill keeps arriving at kitchen tables for years. So how do we break the spell without breaking the courage that lives inside people? Start by slowing the drum. Refuse the neat opposites. Ask the questions that make the story stutter. Who profits from our rage? Who writes the anthem? And who will carry the stretcher? What does victory mean after the first door is kicked down? Who will rebuild? And with whose hands? And for whose children? Then practice a different kind of bravery. The bravery to be bored while talks drag on. The bravery to be misunderstood when you argue for restraint. The bravery to love a stranger who has been turned into a symbol. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of repair. It is treaties and mediation and long tables where people who dislike each other learn to breathe in the same room. That work is not dramatic. It does not make a parade. It makes a neighbourhood. We can honour those who served without worshipping the machinery that sent them. We can praise courage without romanticising carnage. We can want safety without demanding conquest. When someone says war will make us strong, ask why we cannot build strength in schools, in clinics, in bridges and parks. When someone says war will unite us, ask what stops us from practicing unity without an enemy. When someone says war will give us purpose, look around at all the unglamorous purposes that need hands today. The drum is still there. It is old and polished by many palms. It waits for any crisis to pick up the beat, but there is also the garden. It is not silent. It is full of small sounds. Shovels in the dirt, doorbells, laughter that leaks from kitchen windows at dusk. The garden grows when we choose the harder sentences, the ones without slogans. The garden grows when we refuse to let the contradiction become common sense. War is not peace. War is the noise that drowns the delicate work of making peace. Step away from the drum. Lean into the quieter music. It does not promise glory. It promises mornings. The crowd is roaring. The smell is sawdust and fear. And nobody thinks anything strange is happening. Children climb onto shoulders. Vendors shout. And in the centre, a chained body flinches on cue. The lesson is simple and brutal. Pain is a show, and the show must go on. Teachers nod, priests look away, and the town square learns the rhythm of laughter set to suffering. That was the normal. Bears teased until they collapse. Dogs thrown against bulls, while bets change hands. Roosters fitted like little knights and sent to tear each other apart. People dress for the occasion. They take pride in the skill of their champion animal, the way one might cheer a singer. And when the ring is washed clean, dinner still tastes like victory. So when a soft voice clears its throat and says, "What if the animal matters?" the silence is instant and dangerous. Faces turn. The idea feels like treason against tradition, against fathers and grandfathers, against the joy that a whole street grew up with. What if the animal matters? Not as a tool, not as a prize, but as a being with a nervous system that screams without words. The forbidden thought arrives like a splinter you cannot ignore. It stings every time the drum roll begins. The first to say it out loud are dismissed as sentimental, weak, ridiculous. They are told that animals do not feel. They are told that compassion is a slope that ends with madness. They are warned not to break the spell that keeps the crowd together. But a few can no longer clap. They step out of the ring of agreement. They say, "If we must entertain ourselves, let it not be with the agony of a captive creature." This is how forbidden ideas start, with unease in the gut, then a whisper, then a dare. Someone refuses to bring their family to the spectacle. Someone writes a letter. Someone stands between the whip and the target. The town calls them names. The town laughs at them. The town tests them. But there is a mother who hears her child ask, "Why is the bear crying?" There is a worker who spends all day with a horse and knows the horse has moods, preferences, a way of asking and answering. There is a student who reads a poem and realizes that mercy can be taught. At first, nothing changes. The crowds still gather. The coins still pass from palm to palm. Yet the joke is duller now. People glance at one another when the blood runs. A few leave early. The performers notice. They swear and shout and promise even more ferocity next time. But the forbidden idea has started to nibble at certainty. If animals feel, then the ring is not harmless. If animals feel, then the laughter is not innocent. If animals feel, then our fun is built on screams. Then come the words that build bridges: kindness, stewardship, care. Not the wild claim that a dog is a person, not yet, but the modest proposal that a dog is not a puppet. The tongue learns to say creature rather than it. The hand hesitates before striking. The show goes on, a little thinner, a little more awkward, while another kind of show appears down the road. Music instead of mauling. Games instead of gouging. Families begin to choose. Opposition is fierce and sometimes clever. They say pain is natural. Predators hunt, so why not us? They say suffering is a price of tradition. They say men must be tough. They say pity will sap the strength of the nation. And yet, behind the slogans, something quiet keeps accruing. The moment when a farmer calms a cow with a touch. The look in a dog's eyes when it recognizes the sound of the key at the door. The way a bird tilts its head to listen. Each small observation becomes a stone in a road away from spectacle and toward empathy. Laws are late to the story. Before they arrive, people change their habits. A tavern owner refuses to host a baiting. A school teacher tells a fable where the fox outwits but does not torture. A group of neighbours gathers to rescue a mistreated horse. When lawmakers finally write it down, they are only catching up with a new normal that has already started to grow in living rooms and barns and alleys. The paper says what the heart has been practicing. There is no clean victory. Cruelty finds new costumes. It hides behind closed doors, behind industry, behind distance. The forbidden idea must grow teeth and patience. It must push for rules with real consequence and push for a culture that does not glamorize harm. It must teach children to notice, to intervene, to refuse to laugh when someone else is hurting. It must admit that compassion is not a single choice, but a series of commitments. Still, the ring is quieter now. The old posters fade. The cheers move to new arenas where bodies do not break for fun. The generation that called mercy weakness watches a generation that calls mercy wisdom. And the world learns, in pieces and pauses, to look at the animals who share our streets and fields and homes and say, "You are not here to entertain our cruelty." If forbidden ideas have a signature, it is this: they ask more of us than we want to give at first. Less comfort, more courage, less audience, more responsibility. The idea that animals matter did not thunder in. It knocked and kept knocking and waited for the day when we were brave enough to open the door and end the show. Picture being asked a simple question while someone holds your wrist to a hot kettle. What is the truth? In that moment, your mouth does not search for accuracy, it searches for escape. You would say anything that turns the kettle away. That is the terrible logic behind the torture for truth idea. It confuses the sound a person makes to stop pain with the sound truth naturally makes when it finally feels safe enough to speak. Here is the reframe. Truth is not a gemstone trapped inside a person that you can pry loose with pliers. It is more like a shy animal that steps into the clearing when the forest is quiet, when the air feels unthreatening, when the listener is still. Pressure drives it deeper. Gentleness draws it out. Psychologically, under threat, our minds shrink to survival, and our words bend toward whatever ends the danger fastest. That is compliance, not clarity. Think of a time you grilled a friend because you were sure they left you out, sure they meant to hurt you. You cross-examined, raised your voice, demanded a confession. What did you get back? Maybe an apology that sounded hollow. Maybe a story that patched the moment but did not match the facts. In your relief, you took it as proof. And yet, hours later, new details surfaced and the story changed. Not because your friend suddenly found honesty, but because your method finally loosened its grip. Your interrogation pushed for resolution, not truth. When the threat faded, the fuller picture could breathe. Scale that up, and you see how entire societies fell for the same illusion. Pain creates words. Words sound like answers. Answers feel like certainty. Certainty feels like safety. We called that chain justice, but it was performance. Torture made guilt, visible in the body and audible in the air. It gave people something to point to. See? They said it. But a forced confession is just a mirror angled at our fear. It reflects what we demand to see. Here is what truth actually likes. It likes time. It likes questions that do not lead the witness. It likes a listener who can hold tension without needing to end it in the next few seconds. It likes procedures that protect it from the loudest person in the room. In the same way, a scientist designs an experiment to limit bias. The honest seeker designs a conversation where power cannot bully reality into costume. That is why the shift from force to process was a civilizational upgrade. It is not softness, it is engineering. It is choosing conditions under which truth is most likely to emerge and least likely to be counterfeited by fear. A small scene. You are a manager and a shipment goes missing. You tell your team, someone better fess up or everyone will stay late all week. What happens next? You get a name, then 3 stories, then contradictions. None of it is data. It is people triaging their discomfort. Now imagine you say, I need to understand exactly what happened, step by step. No one is in trouble for mistakes, but we are responsible for patterns. Let us walk the timeline together. The mood shifts. The room cools. Details appear that were invisible under threat. The truth walks out of the tree line because the clearing feels safe. This is not sentimentality. It is design. And it is effective because it respects how minds work under stress and how memory sharpens when pressure is replaced by patient curiosity. What makes the torture for truth idea so seductive is that it looks decisive. It looks like strength. It looks like doing something. But it swaps the work of finding reality for the spectacle of forcing narrative. It is faster, but the bill always arrives later and it is expensive. You pay with miscarriages of justice. You pay with broken trust. You pay with a culture that thinks loud equals correct. The forbidden insight is not glamorous, and that is why it took courage to accept it. Truth cannot be compelled. It must be allowed, not force, but framework, not domination, but discipline. We do not get better answers by squeezing harder. We get better answers by asking better questions, by tolerating the awkward space where we might be wrong, by protecting the very people we suspect so that the facts can either clear them or reveal what they did without our thumbs on the scale. That kind of restraint is not weakness. It is the only way to make sure the story we record matches the world we live in. This is the quiet revolution inside every honest conversation, courtroom, newsroom, and kitchen table. A shift from urgency to accuracy, from proving a point to discovering what is true, from fear to integrity. It is the very move great communicators make in miniature, beginning with a hook that names our shared mistake, offering a reframe, grounding it in a lived scene, and leading us to a humane resolve that people can remember and act on. So the next time you feel the urge to press, to corner, to force a tidy ending, notice it. Loosen your grip. Make the clearing quiet. Let your questions be invitations rather than weapons. Because truth can survive hard questions. What it cannot survive is the hunger to be right at any cost. The difference decides whether we extract a confession or uncover reality. The first boundary was a story, not a fence. Someone said, "This is simply how the world arranges itself. The tall stand with the tall. The quiet sit with the quiet. This village keeps to its side. That village keeps to theirs." The story sounded gentle, like advice. It sounded natural, like weather. And then it became a rule. Segregation rarely begins with a hammer. It begins with a tale about nature that feels so obvious it does not need proof. People repeat it at the dinner table, in classrooms, in prayer. They point to the sky and say the stars are sorted, so people must be too. They point to the earth and say roots grow in their place, so people must stay in theirs. Some call it tradition. Some call it science. Some call it divine order. The names change, the shape stays the same. When that story takes hold, doors begin to multiply. One door for some people, another door for the rest. Benches get labelled. Maps develop quiet colours that say, "You may live here but not there." The division hides in paperwork and small talk. It hides in which names get a callback, which hands get a handshake, which eyes get met, and which are looked around. By the time the obvious signs appear, ropes, guards, separate lines, the hardest work is already done. The mind has been taught to see the line as part of nature. Children learn it without ever hearing the word. They see the park split into halves. They see the good school on one side of town and the neglected one across an invisible border. They notice who is told to speak and who is told to wait. They notice who is complimented for being neat and who is warned about being loud. They ask why, and someone answers, "That is just how it is." The story grows horns and becomes a habit. Segregation sells itself as peace. It says, we are avoiding conflict. It says, like goes with like, harmony through distance. It promises safety to the favoured and a quiet corner to the rest. But the cost of that calm is paid in dignity. It is paid in the shrinking of dreams, in the narrowing of streets a person is allowed to walk. It is paid in stolen chances that can never be added back, because time is a gate that swings only forward. To defend the line, people invent new words that sound smarter than cruelty. They speak of purity, of fitness, of culture, of heritage, of merit. They build charts to prove that the line is true. They find old books that say what they need them to say. They point to crime where they have planted deprivation and call it proof. They point to silence where they have trained fear and call it consent. The story recruits numbers and robes and seals, and there is a ceremony for everything, even the dividing of a drinking fountain. But every story can be told another way. There is always someone who steps over. A person switches cars when told not to. A student sits in a desk that is not theirs by their town's rules. A family moves where the map says no. A worker joins hands across a line and discovers their voice stretches farther than they were told. A scholar opens the old book and reads the part that was skipped. A passerby peels a sticker off a bench and the glue leaves a shadow, and the shadow says, "The rule was here, the rule can go." When the first few cross, they are called reckless. When more cross, they are called dangerous. When the crossing becomes a movement, the story that called itself nature begins to sweat. It tries to hide inside new language. It becomes zoning. It becomes decorum. It becomes tests that measure what was never taught. It becomes electrified fences of price and permission. It learns to smile for photographs. It waits for the day people get tired, because lines outlive tempers if they can. Yet the ordinary courage of mixing is stronger than it looks. People sit together and discover the meal tastes better. Children learn together and discover their questions grow wilder, kinder, larger. Neighbours build together and discover that a street is just a long porch. Workplaces mix, teams mix, choirs mix, and the harmonies stretch across what used to be gaps. The sky does not fall. The ground does not crack. The only thing that fails is the old story. Still, the habit is crafty. It resurfaces in new places, in gated communities and hidden clubs, in codes of dress and codes of speech, in algorithms that predict the future by repeating the past, in who gets the benefit of the doubt and who gets searched. The mind is always tempted to sort. The choice is always present, to call sorting wisdom or to call it what it is, a fear that learned to speak. If segregation is a story, then it must be argued with stories. Tell the one about the school that changed when everyone walked through the same door. Tell the one about the patient who finally saw a doctor who understood. Tell the one about the stadium that erupted when everyone sang the same song. Tell the one about the border that turned into a market, then a festival, then a bridge. The first boundary was a story. It can be undone by stories and by steps and by hands. The natural order is not a line between us. It is the river that carries us into one another again and again, no permission slip required. The line can look eternal until the day it does not. All it takes is a different voice and a different habit, repeated until the old tale forgets its own words. A locked door makes no noise, but for centuries, that silent click is what half the world heard at every classroom, every guild hall, every vote, every laboratory door. The idea was simple, brutal, and everywhere. Women were naturally less capable than men. Not less educated, not less connected, not less invited, but less capable as a matter of essence. Nature did the sorting, people said. This belief travelled in the robes of priests and the coats of physicians, in the pens of philosophers and the gossip of neighbours. It looked like common sense because it had been arranged to be the only sense left on the shelf. You can hear how it worked if you lean in close. First came the word natural, whispered like a spell. Natural means unquestionable. Natural means why argue? Then came the costumes to make the story feel official. One era reached for skulls, measuring this curve or that bump as if a caliper could weigh ambition or creativity. Another era reached for nerves and wombs, labelling frustration or resistance as hysteria, as though emotion were a defect rather than a signal. Sometimes the explanation was spiritual, a divine hierarchy, tall and neat. Sometimes it was economic. The home is a woman's realm, as if a realm without pay were a crown to wear proudly. The language changed, the lock remained. Here is the trick behind the trick. If you deny a person education, then step back and observe they lack knowledge. You are not describing talent, you are describing a barricade. If you ban someone from guilds, apprenticeships, laboratories, courts, and voting booths, then say they have no experience. You are not sharing a discovery, you are confessing a decision. Status dressed itself as science. Tradition dressed itself as a mirror. But a mirror only reflects what stands before it, and for a long time, half the world was kept out of frame. Still, even locked doors have keyholes, and through them you can glimpse the contradictions. Whenever women found a way in, tutored in secret, hired as exceptions, writing under false names, running shops while husbands were away, the outcome was not fragility. It was competence, invention, artistry, leadership. The old script had to explain this too. It called these women anomalies, accidents of nature, the rare genius to prove the rule. But that is not how talent works. Talent is not a lightning strike. It is a match waiting for a hand, a box, and a dry place to strike. Imagine a classroom where only the boys are given pencils, and at the end of the day, the teacher announces that girls are naturally less able to write. The test is not measuring ability, it is measuring access. That is what so much of history did. It handed out pencils to one group and nothing to the other, then kept the grades as proof. And when the grades did not hold, the rules bent again. Leadership was redefined as loudness. Rationality was defined as the absence of visible feeling. Creativity was narrowed to certain fields, then bragged about when those fields were dominated by men. The categories moved, the lock stayed still. Challenging this idea was dangerous precisely because it unmasked the arrangement. To argue that women were equally capable was to suggest that society, not nature, built the ladder and then kicked it away. So the defiance often started with smaller keys. Teach a girl to read. Let a wife own property. Allow a woman to testify. Notice how quickly competence appears when permission arrives. As each key turned, a new room opened, and the old story had less room to echo. The pushback was fierce. When women argued for equal pay, they were scolded for neglecting their families. When they excelled in school, they were told it meant they were bookish, but not practical. When they led, they were labelled cold. When they empathised, they were labelled weak. An obstacle course of contradictions was set up to ensure that whichever path a woman walked, she landed at the same verdict. The point was never fairness. The point was control. And yet, across years and continents, the pattern kept breaking. Schools that opened to girls produced scholars. Firms that hired women watched teams get sharper. Laboratories that cleared a bench for women saw results. When the question is no longer can she, but what does she need to do her best work? The answer is always more interesting than the stereotype it replaces. Capacity blossoms under conditions, not under assumptions. So, what do we do with the old idea that women are naturally less capable? You do not argue with it in the void. You ask, who benefits when we call a barrier destiny? You look for the word natural being used like a padlock. You test claims not with folklore, but with opportunity. You count the doors and who holds the keys, and you listen to the places where the silence used to be, because that is where the music is loudest now. The most subversive thought in a world built on that old idea is not simply that women can do what men do. It is that ability is human before it is gendered, that minds are not marked at birth for smaller ambitions. When that thought takes root, the room changes shape. When it spreads, the building shifts. The locks start to look small and a little ridiculous. The kind of thing you hang on a gate you never meant to open. And then someone opens it, and what steps through is not a shadow of a man, but a full and varied humanness that had been waiting, not quietly for the chance to be seen. A throne is only wood until a voice in the dark turns it into destiny. Picture a crown, cold and heavy, lifted not by hands, but by a story, that its weight is heaven's will. This is the divine right idea, a simple sentence with enormous consequences. The king does not merely rule, the king is chosen. Question the king, and you are not just troublesome, you are out of tune with the cosmos. The magic worked best when wrapped in ceremony, a drop of sacred oil on a forehead, a prayer that glides over old stone. Trumpets that do not just announce but reassure. The ritual says the quiet part loud. There is an invisible rope from the throne to the sky, and it does not fray. If you kneel, you are part of the chain. If you resist, you are not just wrong, you are profane. It is easy to dismiss it as superstition, but the idea answered a real fear. Who gets to decide? Chaos is a cruel ruler. Factions fight. Gates close, rumours sprint through markets, and everything feels fragile. The divine right answered with a clean line. God chooses the king. The king keeps the peace, and the rest of us face forward and keep our hands still. A story like that settles the dust. It calms restless nights. It turns the messy business of power into the neatness of providence. But neatness is expensive. Divine right translated politics into faith and made disagreement into sin. The courtroom and the cathedral shared a roof. The king, wrapped in velvet and certainty, grew taller than the law because the law was said to flow from the same source. And so when taxes rose or wars dragged on, the debate was short. The answer was not a ledger, it was a verse. If a crown is a halo, every argument becomes heresy. People are not made to breathe quietly forever. The whispers begin in corners, then in letters, then in taverns. What happens when the sacred makes mistakes? What happens when crops fail, or a war goes sour, or a generation wants a voice? Divine right has a strong answer. Endure. Trust. This is a test. But the longer the list of wounds, the thinner that answer feels. And the moment the story cracks, it shatters. If the king is chosen by God, what does it mean when a crisis unmakes him? Did heaven change its mind? Or did people simply find their courage? There were always subtle ways to bend the story. Advisors who spoke like prophets but counted like accountants. Councils that nodded to heaven while carving out earthly limits. A charter here, a parliament there, all couched in respectful language. Not rebellion, correction, partnership. Yet the deeper truth was pushing through. Legitimacy could flow upward from consent, not downward from the clouds. The boldest proof came when a ruler was not deposed but tried. The courtroom replaced the altar, and the sentence said what once could not be imagined. A crown is not a shield from justice. Still, the divine right idea never fully died. It reinvented itself. You can hear its echo anywhere a leader claims a special light no one else can see. The words change, fate, destiny, history. The mantle is different, but the trick is familiar. Turn authority into a myth, and power becomes unanswerable. The room goes quiet. Questions look like treason. The story seduces because it offers safety with a flourish. Do not worry. Someone above you and above argument has it all in hand. There is a gentler reading, and it deserves its moment. For many, divine right meant more than obedience. It meant duty. A ruler is accountable to something higher than appetite. A king was not supposed to be merely a man with a sword. He was a shepherd, a steward, a symbol. The coronation oath is a promise as much as a spell. It says, I carry your hopes, and I answer to a judge I cannot bribe. When that promise was kept, the idea gave a fractured world a little light, but promises curdle without transparency. The divine right idea warns us about our hunger for certainty. We will trade a seat at the table for the comfort of inevitability. We will swallow mystery if it calms the room. And yet, history's stubborn lesson is that dignity, once tasted, rewrites the recipe. People want to be more than spectators to the sacred. They want a share in what is decided and a language for their dissent. So what do we do with the old magic? Carry it as a caution. Listen for it in thunderous speeches and soft rituals. Recognize how easily a claim of special chosenness drifts into silence for everyone else. If power must be more than chaos, it must also be more than myth. It must be accountable, which is a plain word for a hard thing. It means the rope from the chair to the sky is cut, and in its place is a web between us. Fragile sometimes, yes, but made strong by shared hands. A throne is still only wood. A crown is still metal. Their meaning is what we give them. The divine right idea did not reign because it was stamped in the stars. It reigned because people believed together. And that is the secret buried inside every grand story about authority. The same faith that builds the altar can build the ballot. The same longing for order can find its answer in voice instead of silence. The divine right promised that truth comes from above. The world keeps discovering that truth also rises from below. Picture a hallway lined with mirrors, and in the middle, one reflection blinks a fraction too late. That tiny delay is enough to raise the hair on your arms. That is the feeling of the human cloning idea. Familiar, but off by a breath. It terrifies because it might scramble the most personal word we have, self. It tempts because it promises to save what we cannot bear to lose. Here is the quiet truth most of us circle without saying out loud. When people say cloning, they imagine a photocopy, a duplicate step, a second you. But this is not just about making a copy, it is about forcing a definition. What are we made of exactly? DNA and memory, body and biography? If a body could be repeated, would a life be? The common story says identity is a face and a fingerprint. The deeper story says identity is a narrative we carry in 1,000 tiny routines, a voice that has been trained by time and friction and choice. Not replication, but meaning. Not another you, but an argument about what you even are. Now bring it closer to the ground. A parent sits at a kitchen table with an old photo, whispering the name of a child who is gone. A doctor adjusts a sterile glove and thinks about patients waiting for organs that will never arrive in time. A scientist in a lab watches cells divide like a sunrise in slow motion and feels both the weight of the future and the gravity of the past. In one corner is grief that would do anything for one more minute. In another is hope for a beating heart that does not fail. That is the temptation. It sounds like mercy. It sounds like a second chance. And yet the fear is not melodrama. We worry about the math of power. Who gets access? Who decides the purpose? If a person can be started twice, will someone try to write the ending for both? Our minds are protective here. We lean toward the known because it feels safer. Psychologically, when a line is drawn around what is allowed and what is not, people relax. It gives us a sense of coherence in a world that is changing faster than our stories can keep up. The trick is, lines that are too thick can choke off the very progress that could heal us. Lines that are too thin can let in harm we are not ready to handle. The art is in the boundary, not the wall. There is another layer that makes the room spin. We already live with a kind of natural cloning, identical twins. Two bodies, one starting template, two souls with different laughs, different fears, different ways of telling the same family memory. We have met that miracle and learned it is not a threat. So why does human cloning feel like a cliff instead of a bridge? Because of intent. Twins happen to us. Cloning would be done by us. Choice changes the story. Responsibility moves from fate to our hands, and our hands shake at the thought of holding that much control. Maybe the better frame is not a mirror, but the ship of Theseus. Change one plank, then another. When is the ship no longer the ship? With cloning, we think we are swapping every plank at once, but even then, the ocean and the journey still carve grooves into the wood. The world writes on us. The world would write on a clone. The question becomes less, would it be you, and more, what would this person need from us to become someone whole? That is a question about care, not control. It shifts the focus from playing God to playing neighbour. It moves us from spectacle to stewardship. There is a practical benefit that keeps the conversation alive. Imagine lab-grown tissue that perfectly matches a patient who is out of time. Imagine testing treatments without risking a living person's last chance. Imagine learning why certain diseases whisper through some families like a curse, and finally speaking back with an answer. These are not science fiction daydreams meant to dazzle. They are the everyday reasons people in white coats keep showing up after midnight, not because they want to replace us, but because they want to repair us. So what do we do with an idea that pulls us closer and pushes us away? We respect both forces. We name the fear clearly. Exploitation, inequality, the nightmare of turning people into projects so it cannot grow in the dark. We name the hope clearly. Healing, time, the dignity of easing suffering so it does not get buried under panic. Then we do the slow, careful work that real progress demands. Transparent rules, inclusive voices, ethics that are not window dressing but seat belts. We remember that the measure of any powerful tool is not the tool itself. It is the hand and the heart that hold it. Psychological framing matters here. When people understand the why and the how, they are more open to responsible change than when they feel pushed or dazzled. In the end, the human cloning idea is not a horror story or a miracle script. It is a mirror held up to our values. The reflection we see depends on the light we bring to it. If we carry fear alone, we will see a monster. If we carry only hunger for possibility, we will miss the warning signs. Bring both. Let them check each other. Let them teach us patience. Because the future is not built by running from the forbidden or sprinting toward it. It is built by learning how to hold a live wire with steady hands and deciding together what to power with it. Picture a long hallway of mirrors, each one sanded until every face reflects the same expression. That is the promise of forced conformity. If everyone looks the same, moves the same, thinks the same, then the hallway is easy to patrol. No surprises, no echoes that don't belong. Order is the prize. Individuality is the price. It starts softly, so softly you can miss it. A rule about the tone of your voice, a suggestion about how to wear your hair, a nudge to laugh at the right moments, to sit in the right row, to applaud on cue. People call it tradition, or good manners, or simply the way things are done. At first, you agree because it is easier to go along. You tell yourself that blending in is a fair trade for belonging. You run your hand over the smooth surface of the mirror and tell yourself the scratches never mattered, but sameness has an appetite. It asks for your accent, then your wardrobe, then your music, then the questions that keep you up at night. It wants your doubt and your curiosity and your stubborn little spark that insists there must be another way. Conformity thrives on repetition. It grows strong on the steady diet of yes. It is the choreography of 1,000 shuffling feet, never straying from the marked tape on the floor. It is the prayer recited by rote until the words mean only silence. In one room, a child raises a hand and asks why. The class laughs. The teacher frowns. The hand comes down. In another room, an artist sketches a crooked line across a field of grey. A supervisor erases it, reminds them of the standard, the brand, the approved palette. On a factory floor, a worker questions the sequence of steps, and the line stops. And suddenly the question is the problem, not the machine. Conformity paints over murals with beige and calls it harmony. The strange thing is that this sameness dresses itself in noble language. It promises safety. It promises unity. It promises a peaceful night with no loud voices and no sharp corners. And to be fair, there is comfort in it. There is relief in knowing where to stand and what to say. There's a moment of quiet when you fold yourself small enough to fit, but you are not designed to be small. Your mind is a door that opens and opens and never quite closes. Your heart keeps strange time. Your ideas are unruly and alive. You cannot live forever within someone else's outline. When a culture forces sameness, it learns to fear the uneven beat. It polices hair and clothing because it cannot police thought without first training the body. It rewrites memory to fit the chorus. It convinces neighbours to watch neighbours, friends to correct friends, parents to hush children. It takes the purple thread from your coat because it is easier to remove a colour than to make peace with a spectrum. It demands you lower your gaze because it is easier to count bowed heads than it is to count free minds. And still, beneath the grey and the silence, something taps. The tap is the beginning of every forbidden idea. It is the scientist whispering, "What if?" in a lab, where the answer must be the same as last year. It is the poet who rearranges the words and discovers a new doorway. It is the student who takes a rule apart to see what gears are inside. It is the neighbour who refuses to laugh at the joke that burns someone else. Like a weed finding a hairline crack in concrete, it does not need an invitation. It just needs a little light. Forced conformity tells you that difference is danger. It says that your jagged edge will cut someone. But difference is how we breathe. Every innovation is a trespass against approved patterns. Every leap forward begins as an awkward step sideways. The truth is that uniformity can make a culture efficient, but it also makes it fragile. Without the shock absorbers of dissent, the first unexpected turn breaks the axle. Without the friction of debate, the spark that lights the next path never appears. Imagine a city where every building is the same height. The skyline might be tidy, but it would never be memorable. Now, imagine that skyline with a spire, a curve, a dome that catches the sun at a strange angle. That glint is what pulls travellers toward it. That glint is your voice when you say, "I do not see it that way." That glint is the moment a room goes quiet because someone dared to think out loud. It is not chaos. It is the start of clarity. The forced conformity idea is not just about clothes or rituals or slogans. It is a philosophy that says the collective is too delicate to survive your question. The antidote is not rebellion for its own sake. It is responsibility to yourself. It is the courage to hold a thought that does not fit, to keep your purple thread, to sing the off note that reveals a harmony no one expected. Your difference is not a threat, it is a tool. It is a lighthouse on the edge of a coast that would otherwise be invisible. So look back at that hallway of mirrors, step closer. Do you see the seam where the sanding missed? Press there. Let the glass crack a little. Let light leak in. Someone behind you will see your reflection and realize they have a face of their own. And then sameness will have to make room. Because once a single voice chooses its real pitch, the hallway never sounds the same again. They did not burn the blueprint. They pressed it flat beneath a paperweight the size of a quiet empire and told the room to forget the brilliance under the glass. That is how it often happens. Not with fireworks, with a shrug, a stamp, and a hallway whisper that says, "Not yet, maybe never." The strange thing about a new idea is that it does not just solve a problem. It rearranges who gets to decide. A better lamp threatens the seller of dark. A faster copy threatens the keeper of the original. A voice that can travel without a toll threatens the toll booth. When an invention redistributes permission, someone who has been in charge will feel the floor shift, and their first move is almost never applause. Picture an inventor in a small room with a machine that makes distance collapse. It is no bigger than a shoebox, and when it hums, you can talk to anyone without asking anyone. No meter, no central switch. Just two people and a little courage. They bring it to a committee with polished shoes. The shoes smile. They say words like safety and standards, and we will need more testing. They love the idea in theory, and they will call when the time is right. The inventor waits by a silent phone until the patent office sends a letter with a logo shaped like a closed door. Behind another door, a larger company makes an offer. Not to build it, to own it. The price is generous, the contract is long, and the signature would change a life. They promise a future release, just as soon as the market can handle all this change. What the contract actually buys is time. Time to keep the toll booth standing while the paint is still wet. The inventor signs or does not sign. Either way, a story begins. If they sign, the device goes into a filing cabinet with a better lock. It receives a new name, like risk or liability or strategic reserve. A campaign arrives on morning shows explaining how unregulated boxes can cause chaos, how unlicensed talkers can hurt themselves, how the current system protects you. The machine becomes a rumour. Purchases of key components are quietly restricted. Funding for the inventor's lab dries up. The paperweight grows heavier. If they refuse, the gate shifts tactics. The machine is categorized into a narrow set of rules that make it impossible to sell without a mountain of forms that only a giant can climb. Inspections take seasons. Deadlines slip. A competitor announces something similar, but less free, more controlled with a subscription and excellent parental controls. The fresh idea is wrapped in familiar packaging and offered back to the world with a soft voice. We have innovated for you safely, and yet ideas are slippery. Even under glass they breathe. A white paper finds its way onto a forum. A prototype changes hands at a nighttime workshop. An open version appears, imperfect and loud, built from common parts and stubbornness. A network of tiny circles begins to glow on a map nobody owns. At first, they are hobbyists. Then they are neighbourhoods. Then they are people who have been waiting their whole lives for a way to speak without paying the gate every month. Power responds the only way it knows. It renames the circles. It blames them for storms they did not cause. It draws lines around them in red ink and calls those lines the law. It raids the wrong garage. It makes examples, but it also listens, because the circles keep working in disasters when towers fail. Because the circles help a town find its missing kid. Because the circles will not brag. They will just make it easier to live. Even the loudest press conference cannot drown out a neighbour saying, "I used this, and it helped me." The suppressed invention idea does not walk a straight road. It detours through other countries and other languages. It hides in open source repositories with plain names. It gets rewritten in code that fits on a postcard. It becomes less about hardware and more about protocols. When someone bans the box, others reinvent the conversation. When a part goes scarce, a new design uses a different part. Every attempt to cage it teaches the idea how to slip through thinner bars. What is most threatening to power is not a gadget. It is the habit an invention teaches. The habit of asking, what if I do not need permission to solve this? After enough people learn that habit, the paperweight cracks on its own. The market pretends it was there the whole time. The committee releases a careful approval. The company launches a product that looks suspiciously like the thing they once shelved, but they call it a breakthrough. Everyone smiles for the photographs, and the inventor, or the community who kept the idea warm, watches the world catch up to what it knew on that first humming afternoon. Some inventions were banned, some were buried. Many were simply delayed, because delay is the gentle face of fear. But the world has a pull, like gravity, toward tools that distribute trust, that lower the cost of trying, that let more hands shape their own day. You can throw a blanket over a flame, and for a while the room will be dark. Still, heat gathers under fabric. Still, the ember waits, and breath is patient. So keep your eye on the quiet desks and the unremarkable garages. Listen for the projects people build, so their kids will have less to ask permission for. When you hear a gate slam shut, look around for the path that goes around the hill. The suppressed idea is rarely defeated. It learns our roots, it learns our stories, and then, when we are ready to hear it, it knocks like a familiar friend. Open the door, let it in, and notice how the room, without anyone's permission, becomes bright. It begins with a whisper you can wear, a small patch of colour stitched to a sleeve that turns cloth into a command. A song catches your throat. A map draws a line. A story says, this is us, and everything beyond that line is not. That is the promise and the peril of the nationalism idea. Make the nation your highest loyalty, and the rest of your loyalties rearrange themselves without asking. Before this idea took root, most people were born into smaller vows. You were loyal to the village that fed you, the faith that blessed you, the Lord whose land you worked. Then the nation arrived, not as a place you could walk across in a day, but as a story you could carry in your head. Schools taught a common tongue, newspapers printed the same sunrise in 1,000 towns, and borders became more than rivers and walls. They became feelings. They became family. The feeling is intoxicating. The nation says, you belong to strangers you will never meet, and they belong to you. It hands you symbols that feel like home, a melody the whole stadium can sing, a crest on a passport, a parade where the boots drum in time. It offers meaning to sacrifice, dignity to labour, nobility to loss. It names your dead and calls them heroes. It takes your private grief and turns it into public memory. It says, if we stand together, nothing can break us. But the nation does not grant such power for free. When loyalty to nation sits above all else, it rearranges the moral furniture. Dissent becomes betrayal. Compromise becomes surrender. Your neighbour, who speaks with a different accent or prays in a different way, becomes suspect. The map starts to itch. The borders look unfinished. Old grudges get dressed up as destiny. Leaders learn to press the buttons that make crowds move, and the story of us, so warm in peace, becomes hot enough to melt steel in war. Nationalism sells a simple bargain. Love your country as you love your own blood, and in return, your country will love you back. Out of this bargain came miracles and monsters. It forged unity in places once scattered and afraid. It raised armies of farmers and shopkeepers who marched under one banner and believed they were marching together. It turned the chaos of revolution into a new kind of order. It also lit fuses. It made trench lines and casualty lists. It filled graves with the names of boys who never knew why one hill mattered more than any other. It taught mothers to tie a ribbon around absence and call it honour. It is easy to say, then, that nationalism is only a curse. But the truth is messier. In lands ruled by distant empires, nationalism whispered rebellion. You are not just labour, you are a people. Your language is not a problem to be fixed, but a treasure to be kept. Your songs do not have to be sung softly. In those struggles, the flag was not a cage, it was a crowbar prying open a locked door. The same devotion that fed wars also fed independence. The same fires that burned cities lit beacons of self-rule. So what separates the story that frees from the story that devours? Watch how the nation tells its past. Does it choose a golden age and promise a return, no matter who must be pushed aside? Does it turn neighbours into intruders, complexity into pollution, compromise into poison? Nationalism loves purity, and purity is a dangerous diet. It demands a spotless history, a single way to be, a single voice to sing the song. It forgets, or pretends to forget, that every nation is a patchwork, and the stitches are the most interesting part. Listen to how the nation speaks of the dead and the living. Do leaders ask for sacrifice, while offering only myth in return? Do they turn pain into proof that more pain is needed? The logic is circular and cruel. Because we have lost so much, we must risk losing more, or else those losses mean nothing. In that circle, war becomes a washing machine for meaning, tumbling bodies until they come out clean enough to parade. The cost is always paid by someone's child. Look too at the rituals that seem harmless. the anthem before a game, the pledge in a classroom, the calendar of holidays, the monuments of stone. These are tools, and tools can build or break. They can remind you that your love of home is a promise to care for it. Or they can train you to flinch at difference, to salute reflexively, to let the flag think for you. Loving a place is not the same as worshipping it. Worship asks you not to question. Love asks you to pay attention. The nationalism idea will not disappear. It has woven itself into the daily fabric of the modern world. We carry it in our documents, in our elections, in the way we draw the news. The question is not whether the nation should matter, but whether it should matter more than everything else. If it does, then war is always ready, just behind the curtain, waiting for the cue. If it does not, then perhaps the nation can be a strong room rather than a prison, a language rather than a law, a home rather than a demand. So hold the symbols lightly. Remember that a flag is a piece of cloth until we pour our hopes and fears into it. Remember that borders are lines we draw because we must agree on something, not lines that fate carved through our bones. Remember that your neighbour's story is also part of your nation's story, even when it does not fit the chorus. Be proud of your place, without needing someone else to have none. Let your highest loyalty rest not on a map, but on a code you can defend without a drum in your chest. Nations were made for people. People were not made for nations. And when we forget that, the drums get very loud. Imagine waking each morning convinced that chains were kindness. That is the strange heart of the slavery justification idea. A story so carefully shaped that cruelty could be dressed as duty, inequality could be baptized as order, and profit could speak the language of care. People did not only tolerate slavery, many called it natural, even moral. Understanding how that idea held its grip is not about agreeing with it, but about seeing the seams of a lie that once passed for common sense. Begin with the word natural. Say something is natural, and you make it feel inevitable. For centuries, voices claimed that some people were born to rule and others to serve, the same way the sun rises and the tide returns. They pointed to the rhythms of the household, to the hierarchy of a ship or a field, to the comfort of routine, and called that harmony. If resistance appeared, it was framed as the noise of disorder rather than the cry of a human being. When children ask why, adults often answer because that is how things are. The defenders of slavery spoke that answer in the grandest tones, and many nodded because they wanted the world to feel simple. Then came the word moral. The justification did not stop at inevitability. It tried to borrow virtue. The enslaver's whip became a shepherd's staff in the tale they told. They spoke of instruction and protection, of guiding those they claimed could not guide themselves. It was a paternal story. We care for them. We civilize them. We save them. By recasting domination as guardianship, the justification relieved the conscience of those who benefited most. They could look in the mirror and see not a taker of freedom, but a custodian of order. Religion was enlisted often, not as a whisper, but as a chorus. Passages were plucked like fruit, while others were left to rot on the tree. Duty to one's station, obedience, patience in suffering, these were embroidered into sermons, while the heavy thread of justice and liberation was carefully hidden. In the wrong hands, a sacred text becomes a shield rather than a light. And when a doctrine of human dignity is reduced to a chart of who should command whom, it becomes easy to call injustice righteous. Law followed, turning beliefs into bindings. If the law says a person is property, then every moral word can be wrapped around that fact like ribbon around chains. Paper can make a person a parcel, a soul, an asset, a family, an inventory. Courts can nod, ledgers can tally, and suddenly the outrage of conscience seems like a breach of contract. The idea felt grounded because it was codified, and it felt safe because law often marches with soldiers. Science, or a costume of science, played its part too. Measurements were taken, skulls weighed, noses charted. The human story was sliced into categories and ranked like minerals. The aura of experiment whispered that this was knowledge, not bias, discovery, not theft. Behind that white coat, the old claim was smuggled in: some are fitted to serve. Whenever a ruler looks like a magnifying glass, we should ask what it is trying to enlarge and what it is trying to shrink. And then there was fear. Imagine the fortune that grows from stolen time and stolen land. Imagine the shaking hands of those who know the ground on which they stand is not truly theirs. Fear says, if we let go, we will be judged. Fear says, if the chains fall, the world will burn. Fear is a poor prophet, but a powerful guard. The idea of natural, moral slavery offered a balm for that fear. Keep the order, keep the peace. Keep what you have taken and call it necessary. Language carried this idea like a river carries silt. People were not people but cargo, not families but units, not names but numbers. Even the acts of care that enslaved people performed for each other were folded into a story about how well the system worked. The very survival of the enslaved was used as evidence that bondage was benevolent. It is a neat trick of logic. First take away the sky, then praise the bird for learning to sing indoors. This idea endured because it was profitable, but it persisted because it was plausible to those who wanted comfort more than truth. Many ordinary people accepted it because it met them where they were tired. It promised order in a world afraid of change, moral clarity in a time thick with doubt. It said, you can be good without giving anything up. That is a seductive gospel. And yet, there were always cracks. Enslaved people told their own stories and named their pain, and the truth made a sound that could not be unheard. Some theologians found the verses that had been hidden and read them out loud, emphasizing the image of the divine in every person. Philosophers argued that law without justice is not law. Mothers wept, and fathers prayed, and children learned new names for themselves, and eventually the idea that had built empires began to wobble. It is hard to call a thing moral when its evidence is scars. It is hard to call a thing natural when so many risked everything to escape it. When the edifice finally cracked, it did not fall because one argument won a debate. It fell because reality pressed in. Bodies remember, stories accumulate, and the refusal of a people to be less than human exposes the pretense of any system that demands it. The justification did not disappear. It changed its clothes. New phrases emerged: order, tradition, security, hoping to soften the same hard purpose. So the lesson is not only that the slavery justification was wrong, but how it disguised itself as right. Whenever an arrangement that benefits the few is called natural, pause. Whenever domination asks to be praised as protection, pause. Whenever a ledger explains away a life, pause. The most dangerous lies are the ones that sound like lullabies. The work is to stay awake. The first thing many societies wrote wasn't a poem, it was a filter. A quiet test tucked into marriage contracts, guild entries, land deeds, and baptism records. Before you could show what you could do, someone would ask who you came from. Not your dreams, your blood. The idea was seductively simple. Bloodlines are destiny. It sorted people before they even spoke. Entire careers, reputations and futures rose or fell on a story told about grandparents you'd never met. It felt orderly, righteous, even protective. And it shaped whole societies because it offered something easy to hold on to in a complex world, an answer you could carry like a stamp. Picture a crowded gate at dawn, a clerk with a ledger. A father and his daughter stand ready to work. The clerk doesn't look up when he speaks. Name, village, parentage. The father begins to explain his skill with wood, the hours he spent learning to coax a curve from a stubborn plank. The clerk's finger pauses on the page. He repeats the last word, parentage. The right answer opens a door. The wrong one closes it without a sound. The daughter holds her breath, as if she could change molecules by hoping. The stamp lands. They either pass or they don't. The craft in his hands never enters the conversation. That is how purity of blood takes root. It relocates the measure of a person from the realm of actions to the realm of origins. It elevates ancestry into a moral tale, and then uses that tale to ration trust, opportunity and belonging. When a society believes this story long enough, it stops noticing that the test is a story at all. It becomes the water people swim in. Why was it so hard to resist? Because the human mind loves shortcuts that promise certainty. If I can know everything about you from your last name or your lineage, I don't need to risk being wrong about your character. If I can keep failure at a distance by drawing a line around my group, I can feel safe without admitting my fear. And if I'm already seated at the table, purity justifies the chair I'm in. It tells me I was born into worth, not merely given a chance. There's also a grim efficiency to it. Jobs are scarce, land is finite, trust is fragile. Categorize people by blood, and the world seems simpler. You turn messy lives into neat columns. You call it tradition, and now it feels noble. You call it protection, and now it feels urgent. Behind the curtain, it is still a story, but a very useful one to those who benefit. Listen for the echo in quieter corners. A parent warns their child about the family across the lane. Not like us. A marriage is considered risky because of the wrong branch on a tree. A promotion stalls because of an accent that betrays a different ancestral line. No one says purity of blood out loud. The idea doesn't need a name to work. It just needs repetition. Here is what makes that repetition so powerful. When you're treated as lesser from birth, you learn to manage expectations to survive. You aim lower to avoid humiliation. You internalize a ceiling that was built from someone else's fear. Over time, outcomes begin to match the story, not because the story was true, but because it shaped the path people were allowed to walk. Self-fulfilling prophecies are quiet architects. They build walls that move inside the mind. And if you're told you're better by birth, you learn a different lesson. Why stretch? Why wrestle with doubt? The ladder feels shorter when you've been born on the fourth rung. The danger hides in how normal it feels. Entitlement isn't a villain in a cape. It's the gentle assumption that you are the default, that your blood explains your success more elegantly than effort ever could. So what breaks the spell? Not grand speeches alone, but a change in what we choose to count. When a guild masters refuses to ask for ancestry and asks for practice instead, show me your hands, show me your work, something shifts. When a community rewards the person who shows up and contributes, not the person whose last name sits comfortably in the local stories, the ledger begins to change. When we notice our reflexes and replace them with a pause, who are you actually in front of me? We invite a life beyond inherited scripts. The surprising part is that this isn't only about fairness. It's about getting better at everything that matters. A society that asks, what can you do? Who do you become under pressure? How do you treat people who can't help you? That society has more talent on the field, more ideas on the table, more resilience when storms arrive. It is simply more alive. Purity of blood flatters fear by pretending to be wisdom. But fear is a poor historian and an even worse guide. The story that truly protects us is messier and braver. That identity is a beginning, not a verdict. That character is revealed in choices. That communities grow strong when doors open to hands that build, not pedigrees that glow. Somewhere, a clerk is still holding a stamp. Somewhere, a ledger still waits for an old answer. We get to decide whether the stamp lands on a past we did not choose, or on a future we are willing to make together. Destiny is not written in blood. It is written in what we do with each other now. Picture a hand holding a red pen over a census form, pausing, then drawing a clean line through an entire column of names, as if people could be erased by a single stroke. That is how this idea sells itself. Neat, efficient, righteous. It whispers that the world would be safer, purer, easier, if only certain kinds of people were not here at all. It is the genocide justification idea, and it always arrives dressed as common sense. It rarely begins with violence. It starts with a story, and the story sounds helpful. There is a problem, it says, and there is a group to blame. They are the illness in the body politic, the weed in the garden, the rot in the beam. Notice the metaphors. A person becomes a pathogen, a neighbour becomes a parasite. When someone is defined as a disease, their removal becomes treatment, not murder. Language is the lubricant that makes the unthinkable glide. Then comes a costume change. The idea puts on a lab coat. It borrows charts, measurements, fake theories of purity, fake math of improvement. It promises that if you subtract this group, the sum of suffering will drop. It cites destiny, hygiene, probability. Even when it is wrong, it sounds precise. Bureaucrats translate the fable into forms and files. A line on a budget, a checkbox on a registry, a zone on a map. By the time soldiers are involved, clerks have already made the harm feel inevitable. The pitch always includes urgency. If we do not act now, they will corrupt us, replace us, harm our children. Emergency is the accelerant. Fear is the solvent that dissolves doubt. You are told that restraint is weakness, that mercy is naive, that for the sake of the future we must be hard. In that mood, a room full of ordinary people will nod along to extraordinary cruelty. The idea claims a moral halo. It insists that kindness to outsiders is cruelty to insiders. It calls cruelty to outsiders a bitter medicine for a larger good. It says the earth is finite, food is scarce, jobs are few, and so some must be denied breath. It pretends to be the adult in the room, stern and clear-eyed. It speaks in the passive voice. Things must be done. Steps must be taken. The mess will be regrettable, but necessary. Everyone sighs and ratifies the sigh. One trick keeps returning, the switch from person to category. A name becomes a label. A face becomes a caricature. Once a person is a symbol, you are relieved of the obligation to know them. You do not have to hear their laugh, learn their grandmother's recipes, or listen to what they fear at night. Categories are efficient. They let punishment skip the line and land on whoever wears the wrong badge at birth. In that logic, existence itself becomes a crime. Of course, it never says genocide at the start. It says order. It says restoration. It says making things great again, or forward to a brighter dawn. It prefers slogans to sentences. It builds confidence by repetition and silence. 1,000 small silences add up to a permission slip. You look around and no one is objecting. Your quiet becomes part of the chorus. People often imagine they are immune because they know history's worst moments. But the idea is modular. It installs wherever there is humiliation, economic pain, or political chaos. It adapts to the local myths. It can cite scripture or science, tradition or progress. It can wear a uniform or a hoodie. It can post, print, chant, draft and vote. It does not care if you hate or simply comply. Indifference is as useful as rage. So what breaks the spell? The first antidote is specificity. Say the names, ask the questions that refuse to treat a life as a statistic. Who is your neighbour? What does her day look like? What game makes his children laugh? Specifics puncture the fog. The second antidote is language discipline. When you hear insects, filth, contamination or cleansing applied to people, pause. Say out loud, they are not insects, they are not dirt. The third is refusal of urgency when urgency serves cruelty. Real emergencies demand care, not scapegoats. There is also courage, the kind that feels small and looks awkward. The courage to interrupt a joke. The courage to ask for evidence. The courage to say no in a room that wants a yes. The idea thrives in polite rooms. It dies when politeness gives way to principle. You do not need perfect arguments or perfect purity. You need a spine and a few words. Finally, remember the ancient arithmetic of dignity. No one becomes more human by making someone else less. A society that trains itself to not see certain people is practicing blindness it will later use on you. The lines drawn to exclude will eventually be redrawn to include you on the wrong side. The net always tightens. Once a culture accepts that some lives are unworthy, the definition of unworthy will expand. The red pen still hovers. It is always hovering somewhere. The promise is tempting. A cleaner ledger, fewer complications, a brisk solution to a messy world. But the world is not a ledger. It is a chorus of irreplaceable voices. Tear out one section and the music thins. Tear out enough and the song stops. Hold the pen still, set it down, and let the names remain. They baked a cake with candles and called it a contract. The room was full of smiles that did not reach the eyes of the girl in the corner. She held a dress that was too heavy for her small shoulders, and everyone kept telling her that this was tradition, this was honour, this was the way. She looked down at the frosting, the flowers, the glinting ring, and wondered why celebration felt like a door locking from the outside. For a long time, that was the story. A cloak of tradition thrown over the shivering body of a child just to keep the cold truth from showing. The elders would say, "We have always done it this way." The neighbours would nod, the music would play, and the girl would learn what it means to be told yes when every part of her wanted to say no. The world would turn, the seasons would change, and the child who should have been learning, running, tumbling into laughter would carry a new last name and a burden she never chose. But a question has a way of slipping under doors. What if tradition exists to bless, not to bind? What if the old words were meant to protect, not to punish? Someone whispered this idea. Then another person spoke it louder. A teacher looked at a quiet desk, newly empty, and said the word consent aloud. A mother who remembered her own wedding as a memory made of confusion and ceremony stood taller and asked, "Why not later? Why not when she is ready? Why not when love sounds like a choice, not a sentence?" This was a forbidden idea at first. It challenged the storytelling of ancestors. It bruised pride. It asked fathers to loosen their grip on fear, and asked mothers to walk a road they had not been allowed to walk themselves. It stripped the phrase, "we have always done it this way," of its power, and replaced it with, "we can do better now." It was not a law written overnight. It was not a speech that lit every mind at once. It started as a tremor, then a ripple, then a tide. Girls listened. They heard a different kind of song. Not the drumbeat of urgency and deals made in rooms, where they were not invited, but the slow, steady music of time. Time to grow into their names. Time to let their bodies become their own. Time to study the sky and measure the length of a dream. Time to make friends who are not also witnesses. They realized that tradition without love is just a mask, and love without choice is only a prettier word for force. Communities also began to speak. A village elder sat with younger voices and heard stories he had never bothered to hear before. A midwife who had watched too many narrow hips bear too many heavy futures said enough and meant it. A neighbour who once passed plates at weddings now passed petitions. A religious leader dusted off old texts and found that mercy was written there, not misery. The language shifted. Instead of asking how soon, they began to ask how safe, how ready, how right. The myths were stubborn, like ivy around brick. People said, early marriage keeps a girl safe. But safe from what? And at what cost? People said it was economics. But what is the price of a childhood? And who gets paid? People said it was about honour. But honour should not feed on the quiet suffering of the smallest among us. There were setbacks. There were days when a girl still disappeared from class, and the chalkboard held an empty space where her name had been. There were nights when a ceremony went on in a backyard, lit by string lights and silence. Change felt like a fragile cup carried through a crowded room. But hands reached out to steady it. Laws were written where none had existed, and old laws were enforced where they had long been ignored. Teachers learned to notice the patterns that announce a forced future. Nurses asked different questions. Police officers knocked on doors. Social workers showed up. And slowly, the calendar of a girl began to belong to her again. The forbidden idea grew bold. Let children be children. Let marriage be a decision made by two adults who meet as equals. Let tradition be a living thing, not a fossil used to strike the young. Let a wedding dress be heavy, only because it holds joy, not because it holds fate. Imagine the sound at the ceremony, not the hush of resignation, but the clear laughter of two people who chose each other. Imagine the dance, not a girl pretending to be a woman, but two adults whose feet have walked their own roads to this shared floor. If you listen closely, you can hear the future practicing its footsteps. A girl learns to sign her name and decides to keep it. A father learns that love can look like waiting. A mother places a story in her daughter's hands and says, "The author is you." A community learns the difference between inheritance and harm. Tradition does not vanish. It transforms. It remembers what it was meant to do all along. Carry wisdom forward, not wounding. And so the cake still has candles, but they mark birthdays, not bargains. The ring still shines, but it arrives when two grown hearts are ready. The song still plays, but the chorus is consent. The dress still shimmers, but it does not weigh down a child. This is the power of an idea that was once forbidden. It opens the locked door and lets the light in, until even the shadows start learning a kinder shape. They did not need bars or chains. They needed a story that followed you home, crawled into your pillow, and whispered that your last breath was only the beginning of your worst mistake. That is how the idea of eternal punishment worked. It did not simply threaten, it colonized the imagination. It turned every choice into a cliff edge and every doubt into a trap door. And once you believe that endless torment waits just beyond the edge of life, obedience stops being a rule and becomes a reflex. Picture a community at dusk, centuries ago, with smoke from cook fires rising and children chasing the last light. A voice in the square lifts to warn of the abyss, the unending pit for the disobedient, the defiant, the curious. The words are vivid, more vivid than taxes or treaties or distant wars, because they promise something more permanent than hunger or prison. They promise forever. The idea is efficient. You do not need to watch every person if you can persuade each person to watch themselves. Eternal punishment teaches through theatre. Paint the flames on a wall, carve writhing figures into stone, recite the names of sins with the rhythm of a drum beat. Let fear write itself into memory. Tell children that night is not only dark, but haunted. That rule breakers are not only punished, but devastated without end. Fear moves faster than reason. It does not bargain. It clamps down on the throat and squeezes until obedience sounds like relief. This is not only religion. Kings and councils borrow the tactic. If a society can convince people that cosmic law backs earthly law, then a tax collector becomes an envoy of destiny, and a prison becomes an annex of eternity. Disagreeing with power takes on a new risk when the penalty is framed as not merely painful, but infinite. Why argue with a governor if disobedience is painted as rebellion against the fabric of the universe? Why ask for proof if doubt itself is called a spark that could ignite the furnace? The story gains force because it can be personalized. Every secret thought, every private hesitation becomes evidence in an invisible trial. You police yourself because someone might be listening, and then you police your neighbor because you fear their doubt will contaminate yours. Communities become watchtowers. The idea wears many names across cultures, but its spine is the same. Your life is a test with only 2 doors, and one door never ends. Of course, there is a paradox hiding in that promise. If no punishment can be outlasted, how can it be instructive? If no mercy interrupts it, how can it be just? Many asked these questions and paid for it. Some whispered their doubts, some wrapped their doubts in poetry, some cloaked them in reform. They did not always deny the moral law. They denied the scale of the penalty. They suggested that correction should aim at change, not annihilation. That a punishment with no conclusion teaches nothing but terror. And yet, terror can be politically useful, which is why it was guarded so fiercely. Think about how terror rearranges a society. Art bends toward warning. Architecture points upward to emphasize your smallness. Music swells to remind you of your fragility. Stories pivot around the moment a character slips, then tumbles into unending consequence. When that cosmology saturates life, creativity narrows, exploration turns cautious. But something else happens too. A countercurrent forms. Human beings are stubbornly curious, and when a border is stamped forbidden, someone will press a palm against it to feel the heat. That pressure changed things. Over time, reformers proposed a different arithmetic, that moral growth requires the possibility of repair, and that a justice without proportion is cruelty wearing a crown. They spoke of conscience as a muscle, not a leash. Some challenged the content of hellfire. Others challenged the way it was wielded, insisting that fear is a poor teacher compared to dignity. This did not abolish order, it relocated it. Instead of anchoring obedience in terror, it tried to anchor it in empathy and shared fate. But the old idea never disappeared. Even in modern settings, versions of endless punishment reappear, sometimes stripped of theology but not of absolutism. They surface in the language of exile, in the refusal to forgive, in social rituals that banish people to a lifetime of outside. We still build forever with our words. We still threaten each other with a kind of unending night, even if the flames have become metaphorical. It is easier to summon fear than to cultivate understanding, and easier to command silence than to host doubt. So the question is not whether eternal punishment exists in some metaphysical dimension. The question is what happens to a person and to a culture when the possibility of permanent ruin is used as a steering wheel. What happens is predictable. People avoid honest introspection because honesty can be incriminating. Leaders avoid accountability because their authority rides on dread, not consent. Children learn to imitate piety, to perform compliance, to hide their questions in the attic of their minds. Then, when a real moral crisis arrives, those habits produce brittle courage. A frightened person may obey, but a frightened person rarely reforms the world for the better. There is another way to motivate goodness, the way of consequence that teaches, not destroys, the way of responsibility that invites, not bullies. It is harder. It is slower. It demands that we speak to the best in each other rather than threatening the worst case forever. But it also frees the imagination. It lets people grow beyond fear, not just beneath it. And when fear is not the engine, integrity can walk on its own feet. If you have carried that old story in your chest, the one that says one wrong step and you are condemned without end, ask what that voice has cost you. Ask what you did not attempt, who you failed to love truthfully, which questions you buried, because you thought curiosity was a spark that could burn you forever. Then consider a small rebellion. Consider that a just world requires courage more than terror, repair more than ruin, and that obedience born from fear is not the same as wisdom. The eternal punishment idea was powerful because it haunted every door. Its undoing begins when we learn to open doors again. Imagine waking up to find the sky had rearranged itself overnight just to avoid offending a king, and that king was Earth. For a very long time, people believed the cosmos bowed to our world. The planets, the sun, the stars, all supposedly looped around us in perfect, obliging circles. It was a comforting picture, tidy, flattering, and sealed tight by tradition. If the heavens were a theatre, Earth sat at the royal box. The Earth-centered idea did more than place us at the middle. It bound the universe to a script. It said motion must be circular because circles were pure. It said the stars were fixed to crystalline spheres like jewels pinned to invisible velvet. It offered a moral order to match the cosmic order. Everything in its place, nesting outward in serene layers. Questioning that wasn't just awkward. It felt like tugging loose the stitches that held reality together. And yet, the sky would not quite behave. Planets wandered strangely, sometimes backing up and looping as though embarrassed. Instead of asking if the stage directions were wrong, the tradition added new choreography. Circles upon circles, small wheels turning on larger wheels, a growing clockwork of patches. It worked well enough to predict where a planet might be on a certain night, but every fix was a whisper that something deeper was off. The model wobbled, and the fix was always add another circle. The price for clinging to the centre was not only mathematical complexity, it was the narrowing of imagination. If Earth had to be still, then motion had to be explained with extra tricks. If the heavens had to be perfect, then inconvenient facts were blemishes to be sanded away. Curiosity became careful, doubt became dangerous. The idea of Earth's stillness and centrality was so woven into philosophy, religion, and daily life that unweaving it felt like tearing a sacred cloth. Then came the forbidden thought that had been quietly stalking the edges for ages. What if Earth moved? What if the sun was not our ornament but our anchor? It began as an act of daring humility. A sun-centered view did not flatter us, but it untied the knots. Suddenly, retrograde loops were not the planets changing their minds. They were the natural result of Earth lapping another world on an inside track. The sky's oddities straightened into sense. Saying it aloud took courage. The Earth-centered idea did not surrender easily. It had guardians in cathedrals and classrooms, in old books and old fears. It was not only a theory, it was a world view with legislation. The new thought had to fight on several fronts at once, against custom, against authority, and against the way our senses insist the ground beneath us is still. But the more we looked, the more the world betrayed its motion. Moons, circling Jupiter, shrugged and said, "Not everything turns around you." The phases of Venus hinted at a geometry that only made sense if we weren't the pivot. The sun-centered story, once scandalous, began to feel like the simplest explanation. With that shift, physics found its legs. Motion no longer needed heavenly crutches. Inertia, gravity, and momentum became thinkable, testable, teachable. The sky stopped being a moral diagram and became a laboratory. Navigation improved. Calendars aligned better with the year. The very method of knowing changed. Fewer proclamations, more experiments. Fewer perfect circles, more honest curves. The universe stopped telling us who we were and started letting us find out. Yet it is worth noticing how long the centre held. The delay wasn't because the sky hid its truth. It was because the Earth-centered idea soothed us. It told a story in which we mattered most by default. Abandoning that felt like a demotion. It always does. Every age keeps a comforting centre, a belief that our group, our era, or our habits are the axis. And every time we protect that centre too fiercely, we slow the arrival of better questions. So the lesson is not only that the sun sits near the heart of our neighbourhood. It is that knowledge blooms when we surrender our vanity. Progress often starts with a sentence that stings. Maybe we are not the middle. Maybe our senses mislead us. Maybe our favourite circle is only a circle because we drew it that way. Each step away from the centre makes more room for truth. Each dethroned certainty hands us a better instrument, a wider map, a clearer night sky. Imagine that same morning again. The sky has not rearranged itself. You have. You step outside, feel the ground spin beneath your feet, and the sun does not bend to your gaze. You are a passenger on a moving world, in a moving system, inside a moving galaxy, and none of it cares about your pride. Oddly, that indifference is liberating. Freed from being the universe's favourite, you get to be something better, a curious witness, ready to ask, ready to listen, and finally, ready to see. Listen closely. There is a small word that conquered continents. Inevitable. Whispered in throne rooms and shouted from the deck of ships, it gave kings and councils the comfort of certainty. Expansion, they said, was not a choice. It was destiny. And destiny, wrapped in ceremony and scripture and charts with thick black arrows, excused almost anything. The idea is simple enough to feel harmless. The world is wide, the future awaits. Greatness demands space, and our people are called by providence, by history, by nature, to move outward. Dress it in the robes of civilization or the lab coat of science. Call it progress. Call it mission. Either way, it tells the same story. we were meant to go further. If someone stands in the way, they are standing in the way of fate. Ancient empires learned to speak this language fluently. The city that outgrew its walls promised peace as it marched, order as it taxed, roads as it ruled. To conquer was to bring light to the dark edges of the map, as if the sun itself needed an escort. The map makers believed it. They sketched borders like a tide that could not help but rise, and every wave came with a seal and a slogan. It was never greed, it was gravity. Centuries rolled, sails unfurled, and the old voice returned with new names. A cross raised over a distant shore, a flag planted in strange sand, a charter signed in thick ink. Each said the same thing. The world was prepared for us. The land was available, the people were waiting, even if they did not know it yet. Destiny made rude facts polite. Villages became resources, rivers became roots, forests became timber, gold became proof of a plan. And when someone refused that plan, destiny placed a hand on the conqueror's shoulder and murmured, "Keep going." On the open plains of a young republic, the rails stretched like sentences finishing themselves. From ocean to ocean, the story ran. This is the shape of history. This is the way the river flows. If a home had to be moved, if a language had to be quieted, if a promise had to be broken, the river would not apologize. It would say, sadly but firmly, this is how it had to be. In the 20th century, the mask slipped, then hardened. Destinies were measured with rulers and skulls, calculated with theories of living space and national vigour. Banners announced a future that would be secured with force, and maps became weapons, sharp-edged and merciless. The word inevitable grew teeth. It chewed cities and spat rubble. Again, the promise. Expansion was not cruelty, only completion. A people was simply taking its rightful room. What does an idea this smooth actually do? It absolves. It scrubs blood from the floor and calls it the price of admission. It says the broken treaty was an accident of momentum, the missing children a sad line in a necessary chapter. It lifts the hands of rulers and tells them they are clean, because they are servants of a higher plan. It also hypnotizes the rest of us. If the march of empire is fate, who are we to stand in front of it? And yet, again and again, someone stands, a mother who will not move, a poet who keeps a forbidden tongue alive, a soldier who refuses an order, a village that hides its children and its seeds and waits for the boots to pass. They are called rebels, traitors, obstacles, ungrateful, primitive. But listen closely, and you will hear a stronger language beneath those insults, the language of choice. The counterspell to destiny is simple. We can do otherwise. The line on the map is a pencil mark. The river of history is made of human feet. The cost of believing in inevitable expansion is written in small details as well as grand tragedies. A garden that no longer has a grandmother to tend it. A song sung in a whisper because the loud version was banned. The way a child flinches at uniforms. The way a forest stump looks like a scar. Destiny never stops to catalogue these things. It is too busy moving forward. Does the spell still work today? It just wears softer clothes. We hear it in talk of untapped markets and new frontiers of extraction, in the language of growth that never asks, growth of what for whom, at whose expense. We hear it when technology calls the world a problem to be optimized and the sky a space to be claimed. The map keeps wanting to grow. The arrows keep wanting to thicken. The word inevitable keeps trying to sneak back into our mouths. So here is a different story. The future is not a tide. It is a meeting. We can choose which borders breathe and which ones harden, which roads carry help and which ones carry harm. We can decide that greatness is not measured by how far we spread, but by how well we care for what is already under our feet. We can remember that every map is a negotiation, every destiny a draft. If expansion once called itself a mission, maybe the new mission is repair. When someone tells you it had to happen, ask whose voice taught them to say that. When a plan demands more land, more labour, more silence, ask to see the cost written in full. And when the old word inevitable tries to conquer your imagination, replace it with another small word that can change everything. Enough. They called it a sunrise. It felt like a dimmer switch on your mind. First came the smile, the promise of a better you, the gentle assurance that all your confusion could be cleared away if you just agreed to learn the new words, repeat the better phrases, and sit a little longer in the room where the doors don't look locked until you try the handle. The thought reform idea never storms the castle. It invites you in for tea. It whispers that doubt is a sickness and certainty is the cure. It tells you that if you feel resistance, that is proof the medicine is working. The sales pitch is always the same. Let us take your scattered pieces and arrange them into something perfect. Let us return you to the light. There is only one condition. You must surrender the part of you that asks why. They say it is education, just improved. They say it is therapy, just faster. They promise to unburden you from the weight of choice. At first, it feels like relief. You are surrounded by faces that glow with relief. They applaud the right answers and go quiet when the wrong questions appear. They do not punish you with chains. They punish you with silence, with sleep that never fully arrives, with a room that is always a few degrees too bright. They give you a new vocabulary so your old feelings cannot find the door. They compress the messy shades of your life into neat labels, and then they teach you to fear those labels like sirens in your head. Confession becomes a ritual. You are told to speak every thought that does not match the script. Share it and be cleansed, they say. Keep it and you are hiding from the truth. They tell you your past was broken, your family didn't understand you, your old books were confused, your old heroes were blind. They are not erasing your story, they say. They are correcting it. And if you hesitate, you are told to be brave, to move through the discomfort, to pass through the fire and emerge purified. But the fire never ends. It is not a passage, it is a dwelling. When force appears, it rarely wears a uniform. It shows up as a nudge, repeated enough times to feel like a push. It lives in schedules where your time is spoken for, in gatherings that are voluntary but never skipped, in questions that are asked until you answer them the right way. You learn that compliance is not enough. Belief must be felt. So you practice the right feelings, and they respond with praise. You sleep a little easier. You think maybe you are getting better. What makes this idea powerful is not brutality, but belonging. It offers a home where the noise of the world is turned down and the script is turned up. It offers certainty in a voice that refuses to be questioned, and it dresses the force in pretty words: renewal, harmony, safety, alignment. Who would refuse safety? Who wants to be out of alignment? The trap isn't the lie. The trap is the half-truth dressed as the only truth you are allowed to hold. There is always a moment, small and quiet, when your old self taps on the window. It might be a smell from a place you loved before the rules. It might be a joke you would have laughed at before laughter needed permission. It might be a name you are not supposed to say anymore, rising in your throat like a song. You hear it and you flinch because you have learned to fear the parts of you that still belong to you. But that tap on the window is the alarm that cannot be deprogrammed. It is the stubborn knowledge that enlightenment without permission to doubt is a dark room with a lamp in the corner. Real learning does not gag the student. Real care does not demand you trade your voice for a membership badge. Real growth keeps your questions alive long after the applause ends. If you have ever walked out of a bright room and felt the sting of real daylight, you know this truth. Every system that tries to re-educate by force must create a script to replace your inner narrator. It must borrow your mouth to speak its lines. It must tell you the most dangerous thing in the world is the quiet hour alone with your thoughts. So keep that hour. Guard it like a seed. Let your language stay large enough to hold contradictions. Let your ideas breathe without asking for a permit. Be wary of any place that promises to wash your mind until it is spotless. Ask who owns the soap. Ask who decides what stains are. Ask why the same hands that hold the cloth also hold the lock. You were born with a compass that points toward questions before it points toward answers. That compass does not make you a traitor. It makes you a student of the living world. The thought reform idea sells a shortcut to wisdom, a fast track to goodness, a final version of you. But the only people who think they have finished learning are those who have stopped listening. Better to carry your questions like lanterns, to navigate by the stars of doubt and curiosity, to accept the mess of freedom over the polished cage of certainty. The light worth seeking never demands you blindfold yourself to see it.